Breathe slowly now, as we step into a different century, into a different silence, into a different kind of night that once stretched over the far horizons of the American frontier. The year is the 1870s. The great expanse of the West lies open, not as a stage of heroic duels or glittering saloons, but as a raw and merciless wilderness where each breath of wind carries dust, and each step forward is taken at the cost of sweat, hunger, and bone-deep fatigue. Here, in this wide and unending land, the sky is a ceiling so far away it feels like eternity itself, and the earth beneath is cracked, parched, and unyielding. No fences mark the boundaries. No city streets soften the silence. Only the long grass bending in the wind, the dry soil splitting under hooves, and the restless whisper of storms brewing in the distance. For those who came westward, farmers, ranchers, miners, dreamers, and the displaced, the frontier was not a romance but a reckoning. To survive here was to live in negotiation with hunger, with thirst, with cold winters that stripped flesh to bone, and with summers so hot that water itself felt like a treasure more precious than gold. Pause here and imagine. The wagon wheels creak across uneven ground, their iron rims groaning under the weight of everything a family owns: a few tools, a barrel of salted pork, a Bible, a rifle, a tin cup, a mother's shawl, a child's doll made from scraps of cloth. Behind the wagon, oxen stumble in the dust, their ribs pressing through hide, their tongues dry from days with little water. A man walks beside them, whip in hand, his boots torn at the sole, his shirt darkened with sweat. His face is lined not by age alone but by the unrelenting sun and wind that scour every surface in this place. This is not the West of painted posters or dime novel heroes. This is the West where the land itself is the enemy, where the simplest acts, finding water, keeping warm, crossing a river, become trials that bend the human body toward exhaustion. Listen now to the silence. Not the silence of peace, but of absence. No roads. No rail lines yet stretching this far. Only the whisper of grass, the distant cry of a hawk, the low groan of wagon wheels, and the coughing rasp of dust in the throat. Each settler who came into this land faced the same question. Could they endure? Could they plant crops in soil so hard it resisted every plow blade? Could they survive winters when snow-buried cabins and firewood dwindled to ash? Could they raise children under skies that seemed as indifferent as they were endless? The frontier was a mirror that reflected both the smallness of human life and the enormity of human endurance. Stop now and feel the cold night that follows the day. For on the frontier, nights fell with sudden sharpness. The sun's fire collapsed into a dark so vast that the stars seemed close enough to touch, yet offered no warmth. Families gathered in cabins of rough-hewn logs, the wind pressing against every crack, the firelight flickering on faces worn by work. The air smelled of wood smoke, sweat, and earth. Outside, coyotes howled, a reminder that this was not yet a land claimed by human hands, but still wild, still untamed. The Wild West, as we call it now, was not wild in its glamour, but in its refusal to yield to human desire. Men and women bent themselves against it, day after day, season after season. They dug into it, planted into it, built upon it, and still, the land answered back with drought, with flood, with locust swarms that darkened the sky and stripped fields bare. It was a place of harsh lessons. That the land could not be mastered easily. That survival was not guaranteed. That behind every horizon lay another horizon, waiting with silence and struggle. And so, as you listen, as your breath slows, as your eyes grow heavier, remember that the story of the West begins not with the quick draw of pistols, nor with the flicker of neon saloon lights, but with the heavy, quiet march of weary travelers across plains that seem to have no end. Here is where the myth was born, in the sweat and the dust, in the empty nights and weary mornings, in the endless rhythm of survival. The West begins in silence, in struggle, in the beating heart of endurance. Let us rest here, at the edge of that silence. The story has only just begun. Let us walk deeper now, into the heart of the struggle. The day rises on the frontier, not with gentle ease but with an abruptness that weighs upon the body. The sun, unfiltered and unyielding, presses down with merciless weight, as though it seeks to remind every living creature that survival here is never given, only taken. The light does not caress, it sears. It bleaches the skin, cracks the lips, burns the back of the neck, and bleeds through the thin walls of cabins until even the shade feels heavy with heat. Dust clings to every surface, rising from every step, turning sweat into mud that streaks across forearms and brows. This is not a morning of promise. This is a morning of endurance. A man sets out into the fields, his plow digging shallow grooves into the reluctant soil. Each pull of the ox, each push of the blade, is met with the resistance of earth hardened by drought. Behind him, a trail of dry dirt curls upward, catching in the wind, stinging his eyes. His breath comes in heavy gasps, the taste of dust filling his lungs. Beside the wagon, a woman kneels at a stream, if one can call it that. The water is shallow, brown, clouded with silt. She dips a bucket carefully, trying not to disturb the mud that swirls beneath. This water is not clean, but it is water, and that is enough. She lifts the bucket, her arms trembling from days of work that seem never to end. She knows that later, when the family drinks, the taste will be bitter, the stomach unsettled. But there is no choice. On the frontier, choice is a luxury few possess. Children sit in the scant shade of the wagon, their faces red with sun, their eyes squinting against the glare. A doll of rags lies in the dirt, forgotten. Hunger gnaws at their stomachs, not as sharp pain but as a constant dull reminder that food is never far from running out. Their meals are simple, repetitive: bread, beans, salted meat when it lasts, sometimes a bit of corn, sometimes nothing but broth thin as water. To dream of variety, of sweetness, of freshness, is to imagine another world. The sun climbs higher, and with it comes silence. The fields grow still. The animals retreat to whatever shadow they can find. The very air shimmers, as though the world itself trembles under the weight of heat. And yet there is no rest. Rest is for those who can afford to lose the hours, and here, no one can. A ranch hand mounts his horse, the leather creaking as he rides out to watch the herd. The cattle shuffle, tongues lolling, eyes dull with thirst. The danger of stampede is always near, for fear and heat make beasts restless. A sudden clap of thunder, a wolf's cry, or the crack of a whip, and hundreds of hooves could turn in panic, crushing everything in their path. He rides not with romance, but with vigilance, every muscle alert, every sense sharpened. Work consumes every moment. Work is what holds off hunger. Work is what builds shelter. Work is what turns the wild into something that can be called home. But work also exhausts, drains, and breaks the body. Backs bend, hands blister, shoulders ache. And still the day stretches, long and hot, with no promise of ease at its end. Evenings bring no guarantee of comfort. The sun dips, the sky glows with fire, but the air holds its heat. Around the cabin, insects hum in swarms, biting at exposed skin. Mosquitoes, flies, and gnats fill the dusk air, carrying sickness in their wings. Malaria, yellow fever, cholera. Names whispered in fear, names that still live swiftly in places where medicine is little more than hope and prayer. Inside the cabin, a meager meal is shared. Cornbread, beans, maybe a sliver of salted pork. Children eat first, their parents watching, pretending their own hunger is less. When darkness falls, the family lies down on straw-stuffed mattresses, their bodies heavy with exhaustion, their ears still filled with the ringing silence of the plains. Sleep, if it comes, is shallow. Every creak of the cabin, every howl of the wind, every distant cry of coyote or wolf, is a reminder that safety is fragile. Tomorrow, the same work will wait. Tomorrow, the same sun will rise. Tomorrow, the same struggle will begin again. The frontier was not built in grand moments of glory but in these countless, weary hours, hours of sweat, of repetition, of survival pressed out of land that gave nothing freely. The myth of the cowboy, the legend of freedom, the tales of endless opportunity, all of these would later be woven into the memory of the West. But here, in the 1870s, for those who lived beneath the merciless sun, the truth was simple. Life was a daily negotiation with hunger, thirst, and fatigue. And still, they endured. Not because it was easy, but because endurance was the only choice they had. Now let us turn to the most delicate truth of life on the frontier, the body and all the ways it could fail. Out here, far from cities and hospitals, the human body was always on the edge of danger. A single cut from an axe, a splinter that turned to infection, a fever with no name, a cough that grew deeper each night. Illness was not a stranger, it was a constant companion, lingering in the air, hiding in the water, waiting in the bite of an insect or the wound of a rusty nail. Medicine was scarce, and when it was found, it was often worse than the sickness itself. Doctors were few, their training inconsistent, their instruments unclean. Opium, whiskey, and mercury were given as cures. Bloodletting was still practiced, as if draining life could restore it. Wounds were stitched without sterilization, hands unwashed, tools unboiled. What we would call poison today was called medicine then. And so, families feared the smallest signs: a child's cough, a mother's chill, a miner's rash on the skin. For each of these could spiral swiftly into death. Childbirth was the greatest danger of all. Imagine, here in a small cabin, a woman lying on a wooden bed, her breath shallow, her body racked by pain. No hospital, no surgeon, no pain relief but a damp cloth and whispered prayers. A midwife, if one could be found, brought only experience, not science. Her hands were steady, her knowledge passed down from women before her, but her tools were crude, her reach limited. The labor could last hours. It could last days. The mother's cries filled the cabin, muffled by the thick timber walls. Outside, the family waited, silent, helpless. The husband, a man who faced droughts and wolves without fear, now stood powerless at the door, hat twisting in his hands, eyes fixed on the ground. For he knew that the odds were not kind. 1 in 5 women would not survive childbirth on the frontier. Those who lived carried the weight of scars, torn flesh, fevered infection, or the grief of a child who did not breathe. Death came not with dignity but with silence, leaving husbands widowed, children motherless, and families broken beneath the wide sky. And when death did come, burial followed swiftly. A shallow grave dug in the hard ground, a wooden cross hammered from spare boards, a prayer whispered into the wind. Life had to continue, the cattle still needed tending, the fields still needed planting. Grief was heavy, but it was carried forward, because it had no place to rest. Illness was everywhere. Cholera swept through settlements, emptying cabins of life in a matter of days. Dysentery spread through tainted wells, striking down children first. Tuberculosis hollowed the lungs of the strong, leaving them coughing blood until silence claimed them. Malaria, yellow fever, scarlet fever, each had its season, its hour, its claim upon the people who had dared to live in this place. And yet they endured. They brewed teas from willow bark. They poulticed wounds with herbs. They burned sage, chewed roots, bound broken bones with strips of cloth. They called upon prayer, upon ritual, upon faith, because faith was often the only medicine they had. In the quiet of night, when fever burned and no remedy was left, families sat by bedsides, wiping brows with damp cloths, whispering stories, singing soft songs, waiting for the body to decide whether it would stay or slip away. This was the true face of the West, not only hunger, not only sun, but the fragile, trembling line between life and death that every settler walked. It was not the gunfight that claimed the most lives, but the infection, the fever, the birthing bed. And so, each sunrise that found a family still together, still breathing, still alive, that was victory. Not the kind sung in ballads or carved in history, but the quiet victory of simply surviving another day. Rest here, for a moment, with the stillness of this truth. The West was not conquered by strength alone. It was endured by fragile bodies, trembling in sickness, rising in recovery, and enduring because they had no other choice. Let us turn now from sickness and sun to the other shadow that haunted the West, the violence of man against man. The frontier has long been remembered in stories of duels at high noon, of 2 men squaring off in silence, their pistols drawn in a blur of speed, their honor decided in a single shot. But these stories, born of dime novels, traveling shows, and later, the silver screen, were not the truth. The truth was not clean. The truth was not chivalrous. The truth was chaos. Violence on the frontier came not as theater but as eruption. It came in the drunkard's rage, in the sudden quarrel over a hand of cards, in the desperate hunger that turned theft into blood. Most killings were not staged duels but messy, impulsive acts. A bottle smashed across a skull. A knife drawn in a moment of fear. A pistol fired in anger, its bullet flying not into the chest of an enemy but into the back of a man already turning away. Law was thin in these places. Sheriffs, marshals, and deputies were few, their jurisdictions vast, their power fragile. A single man with a badge could not contain the tempers of dozens, nor enforce order across miles of wilderness. The law's voice was quiet, and often it was ignored. And so, people made their own justice. Vigilante groups gathered in the night, torches burning, voices sharp with anger. They hunted rustlers, thieves, suspected killers. Sometimes they caught the guilty. Sometimes they caught the merely unlucky. Rope was swift, trial was absent, and judgment was carried out beneath trees or in the open square, bodies left hanging as warnings, swaying against the dawn sky. The West was not safe. It was restless, unpredictable, alive with suspicion. A man might leave home at sunrise and not return, not because of wolf or fever, but because of another man's temper, another man's greed. Saloons became the beating hearts of this violence. Their doors swung open to whiskey, gambling, arguments, and sudden death. The floors, slick with beer and tobacco spit, often bore darker stains. Pistols lay on tables beside cards, knives gleamed at belts, and eyes scanned every movement with suspicion. To drink was to gamble not only with money but with life itself. Even in the countryside, violence followed. Cattle rustling was met with bullets. Land disputes ended with bodies on the ground. Families carried rifles not just for hunting but for defense against neighbors whose hunger or anger had grown too sharp to ignore. And yet, violence was not constant. It was like the storm, sudden, destructive, and then gone, leaving behind silence heavy with fear. Communities rebuilt, patched wounds, buried their dead, and returned to the rhythm of survival. But the memory lingered, and so did the fear. The frontier was a place where order was fragile, where justice was often cruel, and where the line between survival and savagery blurred. And so, as night falls upon the dusty town, lanterns flickering in windows, voices hushed after the chaos of the day, we are reminded that this land was never as simple as heroes and villains. It was a place where ordinary people, pressed by hunger, by drink, by anger, by desperation, became both victim and aggressor. The myth of the noble gunfight lives on. But the reality was blood in the dirt, fear in the night, and justice carried not by law, but by rope and rage. Here, beneath the stars, violence walked beside every man and woman who called the frontier home. The West was not a land that ever promised comfort. It offered a horizon of beauty, yes, an ocean of golden grass, a sky that arched forever. But within that beauty lay a cruelty that tested the body, the mind, the heart. In summer, the land baked. The sun rose each day with a merciless fire, and by noon the air shimmered like glass. The fields cracked, the rivers shrank to narrow trickles, and the wells ran dry. Children grew weak with fever, lips parched, skin burning under the endless blaze. Mothers fanned them in the stifling shade of cabins, whispering prayers that hung heavy in the air. The heat brought swarms of insects, mosquitoes that spread sickness, flies that clouded the eyes and buzzed around every meal. And yet, just as the summer punished with flame, the winter came with iron teeth. The wind swept down from the mountains like a predator, tearing through the cracks in every wall, filling every seam with ice. The fields turned white and silent, cattle huddled against fences, their ribs sharp beneath their hides. Men chopped wood until their hands bled, yet the fires never seemed to last through the long black nights. Some nights, families lay together beneath heavy quilts, their breath visible in the cold air, listening to the creak of the timbers, the howl of wolves on the prairie. They wondered if morning would come, or if their little flame of life would simply flicker out in the darkness. The West was never still. It shifted from extremes, fire to ice, flood to drought, plenty to famine. Those who lived there learned not to expect balance, only to endure the pendulum swing of nature's moods. And in this ceaseless battle, survival became something more than daily labor. It became ritual. A prayer whispered not in words, but in the act of rising again, in the act of facing the horizon, no matter what storms it promised. For those who remained, those who endured the fever of summer and the frost of winter, the West became not just a place on a map, but a crucible in which their very being was forged. The land was a teacher, harsh and unrelenting. And the lesson was always the same. To live here, you must bend like grass in the wind, never break. In the frontier, sickness was not an intruder, it was a constant neighbor. It lingered in the dust of summer, in the damp of spring, in the first frost of autumn. It crept into lungs, into blood, into bones. And when sickness came, there was no one to summon, no bell to ring, no footsteps hurrying up the road. The doctor never came. For many, the nearest physician was 50 miles away, and those miles stretched longer than eternity when fever rose, when lungs rattled, when blood would not stop flowing. By the time a rider could be sent, by the time the horse's hooves had carried the message across hills and rivers, the illness had already claimed its patient. The body grew still, the soul departed, and the bed fell silent. And so, mothers became healers, fathers became surgeons, neighbors became nurses. They used what knowledge they carried in memory, scraps of remedies whispered by grandmothers, leaves gathered from woods, roots steeped in boiling water. They tied wounds with torn cloth, pressed poultices to burns, prayed over fevers that no herb could break. Childbirth, too, was a crossing between two worlds, life and death separated by the thinnest of veils. Every birth was a gamble, a roll of fate's invisible dice. Some women bore children in silence and strength, their cries swallowed by the wooden walls, their infants lifted into waiting arms, breath filling the room like dawn. Others labored for days, their strength ebbing with each wave of pain, until the silence that followed was not of peace, but of final rest. Too many graves on the frontier belonged to mothers, their names carved into wood, their memory held only in the gaze of the children they left behind. In these lonely cabins, the act of survival was always intimate, always raw. A single cough in the night could become the sound of a family's undoing. A wound from a rusty nail could fester into a death sentence. A snake bite, a fall from a wagon, a storm that struck at the wrong hour, any of these could decide the measure of a life. There were medicines, yes, bottles of laudanum, vials of quinine, the bitter burn of whiskey poured down a parched throat. But they were not always at hand, and even when they were never enough. More often, it was faith that became the cure, faith in the strength of the body, faith in the mercy of God, faith in the simple endurance of the human spirit. And yet, there was a strange beauty in this fragility. For every life that slipped away, another clung fiercely to the earth. Children who survived fever grew into men and women hardened by the trials of their youth. Mothers who lived through birth carried not only their child, but the weight of all the nights they stared into the abyss and refused to be pulled under. Fathers who stitched wounds with shaking hands learned to trust the tremor, for it meant that they had dared to try, even when the odds whispered against them. The West was never gentle. It was a place where each breath felt borrowed, each heartbeat felt precious. Where to live one more day was itself a victory worth remembering. The doctor never came. But still they lived. Still they endured. Still they whispered to themselves, in fevered nights and in newborn cries. We will not be undone. Out there, where the land opened so wide it could swallow a man whole, where the sky pressed down with a silence older than the mountains, a solitary figure rode. His horse, ribs showing, hooves worn, carried him 1 mile at a time into the depths of the West. Each step echoed the rhythm of endurance, of dust, of hunger, of silence. He had no name that mattered, no home waiting behind him, no clear destination ahead. Men like him were many, and yet they passed each other unseen, shadows drifting across an endless stage. They were the drifters of the frontier, carried forward by hunger, by chance, by the faint rumor of work in some far-off town. One day it might be mending fence posts for a rancher. Another day it might be digging in the earth beside miners, searching for veins of gold that almost never came. Some days it might mean nothing at all, only the saddle beneath him, the empty trail, and the sound of the wind. The West was filled with such men, unmoored from the roots of family or soil, blown about like tumbleweed. Some were veterans of the Civil War, carrying scars that still bled inside their minds. Some were runaways, outlaws, men who had slipped from one life and hoped the desert would erase their past. Others simply sought a horizon that seemed always just out of reach, believing the next sunrise might bring a chance worth holding. But the land did not soften for them. The land gave little, and often it took much. A wrong step from his horse, and the drifter might find himself crawling across gravel for water. A sudden storm could strip a man of saddle and rifle and leave him clinging to life beneath a sky that never cared for his survival. And yet they kept riding. For the ride itself became life, the horse's breath, the smell of leather, the crunch of hooves on gravel, the endless horizon that refused to end. Loneliness was their greatest companion. In towns, they might drink to fill the silence, or gamble away their few coins in the hope that laughter and noise could replace the emptiness of the trail. But when dawn came, the road pulled them again. And so they rode, nameless, faceless, remembered by no one, forgotten by all. And perhaps there was a kind of freedom in that, the freedom of no roots, no past, no expectations. A man could vanish in the vastness of the West, and the world would not blink. Out here, the law was thin, the land was merciless, and life itself became stripped to its bones. The drifter's silhouette rode into the dying light, swallowed by the glow of the horizon. His trail would vanish behind him, erased by wind and sand, as though he had never been. But he had been, and countless like him had been. Silent riders of a silent land, carrying the great unknown forward, step by weary step. And so, in the deep hush of the desert evening, the legend of the West was written, not only by gunslingers and outlaws, not only by sheriffs and ranchers, but by the forgotten wanderers whose names were dust before the ink could dry. The prairie stretches without end, a sea of grass rolling beneath the great dome of the sky. It is not a place of comfort, not a place that yields itself easily to those who arrive. It is a place of silence, of wind, of an immensity so vast that it can break the spirit of the strong and humble the proud. For those who came west, this was no promised land waiting with open arms. This was a trial, a test of will, a crucible in which lives would be reshaped, broken, or, for the rare and lucky, forged into something enduring. The prairie sings and whispers. The wind bends the grass as though stroking the surface of a restless ocean, and in that ceaseless rustling lies a kind of music, the lullaby of the land itself. But for those who made their camp here, the sound was both haunting and unrelenting. It lulled them to sleep, yes, but it also reminded them again and again of how alone they were, how endless the land was, how far they had come from all they knew. Imagine a family, their wagon worn and their oxen thin, settling their camp for the night. A small fire flickers, its glow swallowed quickly by the vastness. Children curl close to their mother beneath rough blankets, their cheeks still streaked with dust. The father sits with his hat pulled low, eyes scanning the horizon even in darkness, for here the silence is not safety, it is the unknown. Behind the quiet, there may be wolves. Behind the quiet, there may be riders. Behind the quiet, there may be nothing at all, only the eternal, indifferent stare of the prairie. The pioneers spoke often of loneliness, though not always with words. The letters they sent home, when they could, carried lines not only of hardship, but of the sheer emptiness that threatened to swallow them. Some wrote of missing the sound of church bells, of laughter in familiar streets, of neighbors whose names they had known since childhood. Out here, there were no bells. Out here, even the stars seemed further away, sharp and countless in the blackness overhead. The prairie did not answer when you called. It did not bend when you pleaded. It simply existed, vast and eternal, and you, fragile human, must find a way to survive within it. There were nights when the silence pressed so heavily upon a family that they would sing, not for joy, but for comfort. Old hymns carried across the grasslands in thin voices, songs of home, of heaven, of endurance. The children listened with heavy eyes, their minds filled with dreams of places they barely remembered, places where rivers ran without end and fields were already tamed by the hand of man. And in those moments, the prairie seemed to pause, as though listening too, as though the land itself wanted to hear the sound of human longing carried into its boundless expanse. But this silence was not without its gifts. For those who listened deeply, the prairie taught a lesson older than time. It taught patience. It taught humility. It taught that survival was not the bending of the land to one's will, but the bending of oneself to the rhythm of the land. The grasses grew, the winds shifted, the seasons turned. To endure here was to surrender to that eternal cycle, to learn the lullaby of the prairie and make it one's own. So they lay down beneath the stars, wrapped not only in their blankets but in the immensity of the sky, small figures resting in the palm of a world that would not soften, would not change, and yet, strangely, profoundly, would hold them, night after night, in its endless silence. And as sleep came, carried on the low hum of the prairie wind, one truth sank deeper than all others, that the West was not conquered in a day, nor in a year, nor even in a lifetime. It was endured, survived, sung to, and slowly, painfully, lived into. The prairie sang on, and those who listened would never forget its lullaby. The frontier was a land of long shadows, stretching from the rising sun to the last glow of twilight, and those shadows belonged not to trees or mountains alone, but to the work itself, the unending, relentless labor that defined existence on this harsh land. From the moment the first light brushed the horizon, settlers rose, bodies stiff and aching, to meet a day that demanded more than they often had to give. Hands roughened by toil, backs bowed under the weight of simple tools, faces etched by sun and wind, they moved with the quiet determination of those who knew the land would not yield itself willingly. Farming was more than planting seeds. It was a negotiation with dust, drought, and unkind weather. Each row turned by the plow, each furrow carved into the resistant soil, was a battle against earth that refused to soften. Oxen strained, groaning beneath the yoke. Hands slipped, scraped, blistered, and cracked. Fingers became raw cords of pain that continued to work because work could not wait. One day lost could mean hunger for a family. One frost, one missed rain, one misplaced seed, and the harvest might fail entirely. Cattle ranching carried its own dangers. Stampedes could occur without warning, a sudden noise or shadow sending hundreds of hooves into motion, crushing everything in their path. Disease could strike livestock as swiftly as it struck humans, and every loss meant not only financial ruin but weeks, months, perhaps years of struggle to replace what the prairie had taken. Wolves, cougars, and other predators circled on the edges of the land, waiting for weakness. Every dawn, the rancher mounted his horse not with thrill, but with vigilance, understanding that danger was always near, and that the life of the land demanded constant attention. Mining offered no relief. Miners dug deep into the earth, chasing veins of gold or silver, yet their efforts were often met with failure. Caves collapsed without warning, trapping men beneath tons of rock. Toxic gases, undetectable until it was too late, crept through shafts and tunnels, stealing breath, consciousness, and life itself. Yet miners descended again, day after day, because the promise of wealth outweighed fear, and because survival in the West demanded risk. Hunger was an ever-present companion. Diets were meager, repetitive, and unbalanced. Corn, beans, salted meat, and occasionally wild game formed the bulk of meals, while the body cried for variety, for nutrients, for life itself in its fullness. Children went to bed with empty stomachs, their parents with the pretense of satisfaction, knowing that complaints could not change the scarcity of food. Each meal was both relief and reminder, the next might not come. And the dangers were not always visible. Water could carry disease, a single sip from a stagnant creek could seed dysentery. Flies, mosquitoes, and lice spread sickness as effortlessly as they spread across the land. Fever struck suddenly, blood ran thin with illness, and families waited helplessly in the dim light of a cabin, fearing that the fragile body might not survive another day. The shadow of labor stretched beyond daylight. Nights were filled with preparation, with mending fences, tending fires, keeping watch over the land and the animals. Sleep came in shallow bursts, punctuated by the cold, the wind, the cry of animals or distant wolves. Exhaustion settled into bones and muscles like an uninvited guest, yet the work would resume again before the sun fully rose. And amid all this, there was the constant, quiet strain of community. Settlers depended upon one another, yet human tension ran as high as the wind across the plains. Arguments over water rights, property boundaries, and grazing land were not rare. Every day carried the possibility of conflict, and every act of kindness was a conscious choice, an intentional bridge over the vast loneliness that threatened to consume both heart and spirit. It was not just a physical battle. It was mental, emotional, and spiritual. To endure the frontier, one had to reconcile oneself to the fragility of the body, the unrelenting hand of nature, and the uncertainty of survival. One had to find meaning in effort itself, in the persistence of daily labor, in the act of rising, again and again, despite the weight of exhaustion and despair. This was the rhythm of frontier life. Wake, labor, survive, sleep, rise again. Each day repeated with subtle variation, but no less grueling, no less demanding, no less miraculous when a family, a ranch, a farm, or a miner emerged from the day intact, alive, and capable of facing the next. And so, the shadows lengthened across the prairie, across the fields, across the mines. But in those shadows, there was also a lesson. Endurance was not heroic in spectacle, but heroic in practice. Survival was not marked by glory, but by waking each morning to face the same hardship once more. Resilience was not a story told in print, but in the quiet, aching hands that tilled the soil, in the backs bent under weight, in the eyes that scanned the horizon with wary hope. The West did not reward the unprepared. It did not comfort the weary. But it revealed those who could endure. It showed who could bend without breaking, who could labor without yielding, who could face hunger, threat, and danger with the slow, steady pulse of courage. And as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with bruised shades of orange and violet, settlers paused briefly to catch their breath, to glance across the vast land that both gave and took. The shadows of the day stretched long, stretching across the earth like the mark of all the unseen struggles, all the small, persistent acts of survival, all the moments that built the real story of the frontier. Here, in the heat, the dust, the blood, the sweat, and the endless labor, the West was not a land of myth. It was a land of endurance. It was a land of quiet, uncelebrated heroism. It was the place where ordinary lives, in their extraordinary persistence, created a world that legend could later remember but could never fully capture. Life on the frontier was shaped not only by the land, the labor, and the threats that came from disease and violence, but also by the unrelenting presence of isolation. In those early settlements, miles could separate neighbors, and the horizon itself felt like a wall, a barrier between one human and the next. The prairie, the mountains, the forests, they were indifferent witnesses to the daily struggles of those who lived upon them. To arrive on the frontier was to step into a vast silence. You could walk for hours, even days, and see no one. The wind was your constant companion, carrying whispers through the grass or over snow-covered plains, but it did not answer when you called. The sun and stars moved overhead, marking time, but they could not provide comfort, advice, or reassurance. And so, life demanded that settlers develop a profound inner resilience, a quiet endurance that could hold them through nights of cold, hunger, and fear. Yet, isolation was not absolute. It was punctuated by moments of connection, fragile bonds woven from shared experience and mutual reliance. Settlers, though separated by distance and circumstance, formed communities of necessity. Neighbors helped neighbors repair roofs torn by storms, tended the sick when doctors were far away, and shared what little food or firewood they could spare. Churches and schools became the heartbeats of these communities, offering not only instruction and ritual, but also a sense of continuity, a place where people could gather and remind themselves that they were not entirely alone in the vast emptiness of the frontier. The church bell's toll echoed across the plain, a signal that, for a moment, there were others who shared this land, this time, this life. Families walked to Sunday service, carrying their children, their hope, their weariness. They exchanged news, advice, and warnings about the harsh conditions, the health of the livestock, the rumors of bandits or rustlers in the area. In the simple act of coming together, they created a small sphere of stability, a buffer against the constant uncertainty that defined the frontier. Schoolhouses, too, carried an importance far beyond education. Within their rough-hewn walls, children learned reading and arithmetic, yes, but they also learned stories of the wider world, of survival, of moral lessons carried from one generation to the next. Teachers became pillars of these settlements, guiding not just minds, but hearts, helping children navigate a life that demanded both courage and patience from the youngest members of society. Yet even in community, the weight of hardship never lifted. Disputes were inevitable over land boundaries, grazing rights, water access, or the misdeeds of a neighbor. Arguments could flare into violence, and the law was often too distant or too weak to intervene. Justice was administered in imperfect ways, by consensus or by vigilance, and mistakes could be deadly. These tensions, subtle or overt, reminded settlers that community was fragile, a delicate lattice of cooperation, fear, respect, and shared necessity. Loneliness and longing remained companions even in the midst of neighbors and friends. Letters from distant family brought joy and sorrow in equal measure, reading of births, deaths, and marriages far away, and reminding settlers of the life left behind. Birthdays were celebrated quietly, often with the simplest of gifts or a shared meal. Deaths were marked by somber gatherings, graves dug in rocky soil, prayers whispered into the wind. In both life and death, people clung to each other as best they could, understanding that connection was not merely desirable, it was essential for survival. In the evenings, after the day's labor had ended, settlers often gathered by fires outside their cabins, sharing stories, songs, and laughter that felt precious precisely because it was fleeting. Children played under the dim glow of lanterns, their eyes wide with wonder and exhaustion, while adults spoke of their labors, of storms weathered, of the animals tended, of the crops that might grow or might fail. These moments were small, ephemeral, but they were the threads that held the fragile fabric of frontier life together. And yet, isolation always returned. The quiet of the prairie at night reminded every settler of their vulnerability. Wolves howled, wind rattled the cabin walls, the moon cast long, empty shadows across the plains. Every sound became amplified, every movement a potential threat. And yet, the human spirit persisted, holding fast to routines, rituals, and relationships that created meaning and comfort against the vastness of solitude. In this balance between isolation and community, the frontier revealed the depth of human endurance. It taught settlers that survival was not only a matter of skill or labor, but also of heart, of patience, of empathy, of the courage to reach out across the empty miles, to build a neighborly bond, to trust, to grieve, and to celebrate, even in the face of relentless challenge. The West, in all its immensity, was a teacher of both despair and hope. It was merciless, yet it forced the creation of connection. It was vast, yet it demanded intimacy. It was unforgiving, yet it gave those who persevered the quiet, profound satisfaction of knowing that even amidst isolation, human bonds could endure, delicate as grass in the wind, yet resilient as the land itself. And as the firelight dimmed, as children's eyes closed and parents leaned wearily against one another, there was a subtle recognition. The frontier was not conquered by force alone, nor by wealth or weapon, nor even by courage in isolation. It was conquered, day by day, by the quiet persistence of human connection, by the fragile yet unyielding bonds of community, by the unspoken understanding that no one, no matter how isolated, need ever face the vastness entirely alone. Beyond the cabin door lay the unknown. The prairie stretched endlessly, a place of both promise and peril, and every step outside carried a silent, invisible question. Would I return? Settlers knew that danger was rarely announced. It crept. It shifted. It arrived silently, suddenly, and often lethally. The animals of the frontier, wolves, cougars, bears, were not merely stories or legends to frighten children. They were hunters, moving under moonlight or dusk, taking only what was available and reminding every human that they too were part of the ecosystem, vulnerable and mortal. A careless step into high grass could bring a snake strike. A faint rustle in the bushes could mean a predator watching, waiting. Every shadow had the potential for threat. Disease was an unseen predator. Came with the water, the dust, the food. Dysentery, smallpox, influenza, and tuberculosis could strike suddenly. A cough in the night, a fever by dawn, and a life could hang in the balance. Without trained physicians nearby, without medicine that could reliably save, every illness was a gamble. Families prayed, relied on herbs, on poultices, on hope, and sometimes, that hope was all that separated life from death. Accidents claimed their share as well. The frontier was built of wood, stone, and raw labor. Wagons tipped over on uneven roads, axes slipped while chopping wood, falls from ladders or horses left broken bones with no proper care. Each injury carried the possibility of permanent disability, or worse. Even the tools meant to sustain life were instruments of risk, and every day was a negotiation with chance itself. Weather was another adversary, vast and indifferent. Storms could appear in minutes, thunderclouds rolling over plains and mountains with fury. Lightning struck cabins, fields, and lone travelers alike. Snowstorms buried paths and fences, freezing livestock and isolating families for days. Droughts parched the soil, while floods carried away everything not tied down. Heat waves baked bodies and minds alike, and cold could seep into the bones, quiet and unyielding. Nature did not relent. It demanded respect, vigilance, and adaptability. Even fellow humans could bring danger. Law enforcement was sparse, and the social fabric fragile. Disputes escalated quickly, fueled by alcohol, desperation, or old grudges. Violence was spontaneous, chaotic, and often fatal. Towns were filled with rough men and women, each trying to carve out survival, and every encounter carried the potential for bloodshed. Vigilante justice, unchecked by courts or lawmen, could transform a disagreement into a tragedy. Yet, despite all this, settlers continued. They built fences, planted crops, tended animals, hunted, and traveled across the wild land. Each day was both a struggle and a testament to human endurance. The dangers beyond the cabin door were constant, yet life continued, fragile and beautiful. A child's laughter, the warm smell of bread baking, the glow of a fire at night. These small comforts gained immense significance precisely because they existed amid such peril. And in this constant negotiation with danger, the frontier revealed the depth of human courage and ingenuity. People learned to read the sky, to recognize signs of illness, to navigate the land safely. They learned patience, vigilance, and the quiet joy of small victories. Survival became a skill, a discipline, a meditation of its own kind, an awareness that every step mattered, every choice carried consequence, and every day lived was both a victory and a gift. The West demanded humility. It demanded observation. It demanded a careful listening to the whispers of the wind, the rustle of grass, the subtle changes in the air. The cabin door, a thin barrier between safety and the vast unknown, represented the fragile boundary between life and loss, between the human world and the indifferent, untamed wilderness. And as night descended, as the stars emerged endless and silent, settlers learned to exist in harmony with danger, rather than in denial of it. Each shadow carried risk, yes, but also life. Each predator, each storm, each accident, each disease, was part of the rhythm of existence on the frontier, a rhythm that shaped the body, honed the mind, and tempered the spirit. Here, in the quiet of the night, with the prairie stretching into infinity, the West revealed itself fully, not in the glamour of guns or gold, not in the exaggerated tales of heroic figures, but in the unvarnished truth of survival, in the constant, delicate negotiation between human courage and the relentless world beyond the cabin door. It was a life of vigilance, endurance, and quiet heroism. And those who lived it learned to walk the fine line between fear and resolve, between caution and courage, between despair and the fragile joy of simply waking to see another day. The West was not a monolith. It was a convergence of lives, cultures, and ambitions, a living mosaic of difference pressed into the vastness of the land. To walk the streets of a frontier town was to see the diversity of the human spirit, carried on bodies that bore the marks of long journeys, hardship, and survival. Every step revealed stories layered with labor, longing, and the complicated negotiation of identity in a place simultaneously full of opportunity and fraught with prejudice. Chinese immigrants arrived, often drawn by work on the railroads, by the faint promise of wages, and by the hope of a life not bound by the strictures of their homeland. They tilled the soil, constructed the rails, labored in mines, and brought skills that quietly shaped the emerging infrastructure of the West. Yet, they were marginalized, targeted by laws and custom alike, facing discrimination and hostility that shadowed every achievement. Their presence was essential, their contributions undeniable, and yet they were often rendered invisible by the prevailing narratives of the land. Mexican Americans and Tejano, descendants of lands long incorporated into the United States, navigated a new reality that challenged traditions and sovereignty alike. Their ranching techniques, their knowledge of the land, and their resilience under shifting political borders were crucial to survival in the harsh frontier environment. And yet, they too faced encroachment, dispossession, and legal battles over lands that had been theirs for generations. Every small victory came at the cost of constant vigilance, negotiation, and the enduring weight of prejudice. Black cowboys, freedmen, and African American settlers contributed profoundly to the life of the West. They guided herds across long drives, worked in mines, raised families, and carved out communities in places both welcoming and hostile. Their presence challenged the simplifying myths of the West as a purely white landscape, showing that resilience, skill, and courage were not bounded by color. Yet racism remained ever-present, a social friction that shaped interactions, limited opportunities, and created daily dangers, even as black settlers claimed a vital place in the frontier story. Native Americans, keepers of land, tradition, and history stretching back centuries, faced catastrophic displacement and cultural erosion. Treaties were broken, villages burned, hunting grounds stolen, and children taken to distant schools designed to erase their languages, their beliefs, and their very identity. The arrival of settlers, railroads, and corporations was not merely a movement of bodies, but a displacement of entire ways of life. Survival for native peoples became a battle not only for food and shelter, but for memory, culture, and the right to exist on the land they had nurtured for generations. In towns, tensions simmered alongside cooperation. Markets and streets became stages for subtle negotiations of power and respect. Trades were conducted across linguistic and cultural barriers. Children of diverse backgrounds sometimes played together, learning skills and forming friendships that transcended the prejudice of adults. And yet, beneath the surface, divisions remained. Whispers of distrust, the sharp edge of competition, the invisible lines drawn by law, custom, or fear. Everyday survival in this cultural mosaic required adaptability. Learning to navigate difference became as vital as tending a crop, herding cattle, or guarding against the sudden sweep of a prairie storm. Conversations, negotiations, and even casual interactions carried weight, teaching lessons in patience, observation, and empathy. To thrive, a settler needed to recognize not only the unpredictability of nature, but also the unpredictability of human behavior, an equally potent force shaping the outcomes of each day. And yet, even in tension, there was beauty. Festivals, markets, and communal gatherings revealed the depth and richness of the West's diversity. Music, food, language, and ritual intertwined, creating moments of shared humanity. A song sung in Spanish might echo beside a hymn carried by a church congregation. Recipes, crafts, and stories traveled across boundaries, leaving traces of influence, adaptation, and mutual respect. Life was difficult, sometimes brutal, yet it was never uniform. It was a living, breathing tableau of difference, of resilience, of the human capacity to coexist, even when the odds seemed stacked against understanding. The mosaic of the West was a reminder that survival was not merely physical. It was social, psychological, and moral. Every handshake, every shared meal, every act of neighborly kindness carried weight. Every insult, every slight, every act of exclusion shaped the fragile balance between cooperation and conflict. And in this delicate equilibrium, the true story of the frontier emerges, not as a simple tale of heroism or villainy, but as a complex narrative of human beings negotiating identity, belonging, and survival in a land that demanded both endurance and insight. Here, amid the dust and wind, the labor and danger, the long stretches of solitude and the small islands of connection, the West revealed its profound paradox. A land of isolation that forced community, a land of danger that demanded courage, a land of difference that required understanding. The mosaic was imperfect, uneven, and sometimes tragic, but it was human, fully and irrevocably human. And as night settled over the town, as lanterns flickered in windows and the wind whispered across the plains, the people of the frontier carried with them the knowledge that their lives were intertwined, fragile yet resilient, threatened yet enduring. Each day survived, each connection made, each boundary navigated, became part of the story, adding layer upon layer to the enduring, complex, and sometimes heartbreaking narrative of the American West. The West has been immortalized in myth as a place of heroes, quick-draw duels, and clean, cinematic justice. Yet reality, as it so often does, was far more complex, far less glamorous, far more human. Law on the frontier was sparse, uneven, and fragile. It was not the noble, steadfast institution depicted in stories, but a fragile framework struggling to contain the unpredictable, chaotic, and often violent impulses of those trying to survive in a harsh and unforgiving environment. Sheriffs were real people, chosen or elected, sometimes respected, sometimes feared, always limited in their power. They had no police force behind them beyond a handful of deputies. They could not be everywhere at once. A theft, a brawl, or a murder might occur miles from the nearest office, leaving justice to chance, or to the hands of the victims themselves. Vigilante justice, rough and ready, became a practical necessity rather than a romantic adventure. Families, neighbors, and entire towns occasionally took the law into their own hands, attempting to protect themselves in ways that were messy, imperfect, and often brutal. The gunfighter of legend, the man who could draw with lightning speed and shoot with accuracy, was rarely the central figure of frontier violence. Most confrontations were impulsive, fueled by anger, alcohol, desperation, or fear. Shots rang out spontaneously, not with choreographed heroism, but with chaotic danger. One wrong movement, one sudden glare, one perceived insult, and life could be lost in a heartbeat. These moments were terrifying, random, and deeply human, rather than the stylized duels portrayed in dime novels or the silver screen. Even inside towns, danger was constant. Saloons were centers of social life, but they were also flashpoints of conflict. Arguments over debts, insults, card games, or perceived slights escalated quickly, and violence could erupt anywhere, often leaving permanent scars on those involved. And while townsfolk often told stories of heroes and outlaws, the reality was far more nuanced. Most people survived by avoiding conflict, by negotiation, by careful attention to the temperament of others, rather than by extraordinary skill with a revolver. The law extended inconsistently into the countryside. Homesteads, ranches, and mining camps were often hundreds of miles from the nearest town or sheriff. Travelers faced not only the natural dangers of storms, animals, and terrain, but also human threats, robbery, rustling, or violence born of desperation. A family traveling across the plains had to carry both food and the means to defend themselves, a rifle or a revolver, not for show, but as a necessity of survival. Every encounter carried weight, every stranger was a potential risk, and every day demanded awareness, patience, and judgment. Justice, when it came, was slow and unpredictable. Courts could be distant, records were often incomplete, and witnesses were few. Many crimes went unpunished, many punishments were extrajudicial. Hanging, flogging, or banishment occurred as needed, often without ceremony, often without fairness. It was a stark, sobering world in which morality, law, and necessity often collided. The frontier demanded judgment, decisiveness, and, sometimes, the courage to act alone. Yet even in this chaos, there were principles, informal, learned over time, codified in behavior rather than in law. Respect for property, awareness of danger, negotiation of disputes, and careful observation of human behavior were as essential to survival as skill with a plow or rifle. Social codes emerged in informal ways. A handshake, a shared meal, a promise kept, or a warning whispered. These were the threads holding the social fabric together, delicate, human, and sometimes tragically fragile. And so, the frontier became a teacher once more, teaching that heroism was not always public, not always dramatic, not always visible in stories of fame or legend. Heroism could be the father who prevented a fight from escalating in the saloon, the mother who protected children during a storm, the neighbor who intervened to stop theft or violence. It could be the quiet, daily courage of surviving danger, navigating social tensions, and living with awareness in a world that often offered no second chances. The myths of the West, of gunfighters and duels, of clear lines between good and evil, were comforting, but they were false. Real life on the frontier was messy, chaotic, often frightening, yet profoundly human. Each shot fired, each decision made, each act of restraint or intervention shaped the outcome of communities, families, and individual lives. Law was not an institution. It was a practice, learned daily, experienced fully, and carried in the memory and decisions of every human on the land. And as the sun dipped low over the wooden buildings, casting long shadows down the dusty streets, the frontier whispered its truth. Courage was measured not by fame, but by endurance, by awareness, by living fully, responsibly, and compassionately in a world that demanded both vigilance and humanity. The West was not conquered by those with the fastest draw. It was survived day by day, by those who learned to navigate its chaos, respect its power, and act with wisdom, patience, and quiet courage. Survival on the frontier demanded not only courage and skill, but also unrelenting labor, patience, and the acceptance of constant uncertainty. Economic life was a delicate balance between effort and reward, a negotiation with the land, the weather, and the unpredictable tides of fortune. Each venture, whether mining, ranching, or farming, carried with it the possibility of success, the hope of prosperity, and the ever-present risk of loss. Mining towns rose with feverish energy, driven by dreams of gold, silver, and other precious minerals. Men arrived from distant lands, packs heavy with hope, tools strapped to their backs, eyes bright with ambition. The promise of wealth was intoxicating, and for a time, the work seemed worth every ache, every blister, every risk of collapse or injury. Miners dug deep into the earth, carving tunnels and shafts in search of fortune. But the earth was unforgiving. Cave-ins occurred without warning, suffocating smoke or toxic gases lingered in the depths, and accidents were frequent and often fatal. Wages were meager, and many who labored in the mines emerged no richer than when they had arrived, their bodies weary, their hands scarred, their spirits tested. Ranching, too, was a perilous endeavor. Cattle drives stretched for hundreds of miles, navigating rivers, canyons, and open plains. Stampedes could erupt without notice, scattering herds, injuring men, and ending lives in an instant. Disease afflicted both animals and humans, while harsh winters and scorching summers tested endurance daily. Success demanded foresight, skill, and tireless effort, and even then, prosperity remained uncertain. Markets fluctuated, rustlers threatened, and droughts or floods could erase months of labor in a single season. Farming was no less arduous. The land, often rugged and unforgiving, resisted cultivation. Soil could be poor or rocky, rainfall unpredictable, and pests relentless. Crops failed in spite of tireless effort, and harvests were frequently modest. Every day required hours of physical labor, from breaking the soil to planting, weeding, and tending the growing plants. The work never ended, yet the rewards were fragile and subject to forces beyond human control. Farmers lived with a constant awareness that despite all their toil, fate could overturn their work in a single storm, fire, or blight. Wage labor offered no certainty. Factory work, railway construction, and logging brought long hours and backbreaking toil, with meager pay and frequent injuries. Compensation was often delayed, insufficient, or entirely absent, and laborers were expected to endure hardship with little recourse. The promise of steady work was itself precarious, contingent on demand, natural conditions, and the whims of distant corporate owners. Every penny earned was hard-won, a testament to persistence, endurance, and resilience. Financial hardship was compounded by isolation. Credit could be difficult to obtain, markets were distant, and transportation was slow. A single misstep, a delayed shipment, a failed harvest, or a medical emergency could plunge a family into crisis. Success was measured not only in gold or grain, but in survival itself, in the ability to continue another day, to feed one's children, to repair one's home, to persist despite the uncertainty. And yet, within this hardship, there was hope, faint but persistent. The frontier was a place where ambition met possibility, where effort sometimes bore reward, where small victories, an extra sack of grain, a successful drive, a vein of silver, could sustain the spirit. Community again played a role. Neighbors shared knowledge, labor, and occasionally resources, reminding each other that while the land could be harsh, human connection could soften its blow. The frontier taught lessons in patience, adaptability, and humility. Wealth could vanish in a day, but resilience, skill, and courage could endure indefinitely. Success was never guaranteed, yet effort was never wasted. Each day of labor built knowledge, endurance, and the capacity to confront the next challenge. Prosperity was a tenuous promise, fragile and fleeting, yet powerful enough to draw people across continents and oceans, to stake lives on the hope of opportunity, and to create communities where none had existed before. The West, in its harshness, demanded more than work. It demanded understanding, foresight, and the quiet acceptance of uncertainty. The rewards were uneven, the costs immense, yet those who persevered gained not only sustenance, but also a profound understanding of life's rhythms, the interdependence of labor, land, weather, and human effort, the delicate balance between risk and reward, and the quiet satisfaction of enduring against adversity. Through mining, ranching, farming, and labor, the frontier became both a crucible and a classroom. It forged resilience, patience, and courage. It offered lessons that could not be learned in comfort, that could not be taught by law or literature, but only experienced through sweat, struggle, and the unwavering march of days spent in confrontation with a world that was indifferent, often cruel, but also alive, full of possibility, and profoundly human. And in every weary hand, in every calloused back, in every child's eyes filled with wonder or fatigue, the story of the frontier was written. A story not of guaranteed fortune, but of endurance, not of comfort, but of courage, not of certainty, but of the delicate, persistent hope that life, however tenuous, could continue, thrive, and leave a legacy upon the land, the people, and the memory of all who called the West their home. On the frontier, the fragility of life was a constant presence. Every cough, every fever, every cut or bruise carried weight far beyond its immediate appearance. Medical care was rudimentary at best, perilous at worst, and the simplest ailments could escalate into mortal threats. Families relied on a patchwork of knowledge, herbs passed down through generations, home remedies improvised from the land, and the occasional guidance of a traveling doctor whose skill varied widely and whose reach was limited by the expanse of the plains, mountains, and forests. Childbirth was particularly perilous. Women labored at home, often without experienced assistance, relying on midwives or relatives whose knowledge was drawn from observation and experience rather than formal training. Complications were frequent, and mortality rates were high. Mothers, babies, or both could die, leaving families devastated and communities acutely aware of the tenuous thread that separated life from death. Each birth was both a miracle and a risk, celebrated when it survived, mourned when it did not. Disease was a silent, omnipresent adversary. Smallpox, influenza, typhoid, and cholera spread with terrifying ease, particularly in settlements lacking proper sanitation. Water from shallow wells or streams could carry unseen pathogens. Dust and heat contributed to respiratory ailments. A simple scrape could become infected, a broken bone could fester. Even minor illnesses demanded constant vigilance, because medical intervention, when available, often did more harm than good. Amputations, unsterilized instruments, and treatments based on superstition or incomplete knowledge were all too common, and survival often depended on luck as much as care. Settlers improvised continuously. They boiled water, brewed teas from herbs, applied poultices, and tied splints with rope or cloth. Every effort was an attempt to stave off the inevitable, to bend the harsh reality of the frontier toward life rather than death. Mothers, fathers, neighbors, and even children became caregivers, holding vigil over the sick through the night, whispering words of comfort, monitoring fever, and hoping that their efforts might tip the balance toward survival. Mental strain accompanied physical danger. The constant presence of illness, injury, and death weighed heavily upon settlers. Anxiety and exhaustion were routine, often compounded by isolation. Even in the presence of family or community, the awareness that disaster could strike at any moment, through accident, disease, or childbirth, created an undercurrent of fear, tempered only by human endurance and the slow accumulation of experience in responding to crisis. Frontier medicine was also defined by improvisation. Herbs, roots, and minerals were combined in remedies passed down through oral tradition. Tinctures were made, poultices applied, and prayers whispered. Sometimes these treatments were effective, sometimes they caused harm. The line between hope and desperation was narrow. The margin between life and death was paper-thin, and every day demanded vigilance, knowledge, and adaptability. Settlers learned to observe patterns, recognizing early signs of illness, adjusting diets, tending wounds meticulously, isolating the sick, and using the knowledge of seasons, weather, and environment to their advantage. Experience became their teacher, and intuition their most reliable guide. Those who survived did so through observation, adaptation, and the quiet endurance of countless trials, learning each day how fragile life truly was, and how resilient the human spirit could become in response. Hospitals were rare, distant, and often primitive. Most medical intervention occurred at home, under candlelight or firelight, in small cabins or makeshift rooms. Every fever, cough, or injury demanded attention and care from those closest, relying on human skill, compassion, and improvisation. Even when doctors arrived, their tools and techniques were limited. Antiseptics were uncommon, anesthesia rare, and knowledge incomplete. Treatment was often experimental, driven as much by necessity as by understanding. And yet, amid these challenges, life endured. Communities learned to support one another, to share knowledge, to provide aid in times of need. Midwives traveled between cabins, neighbors carried water to the sick, and families persevered, cultivating hope in the face of constant danger. Every recovery, every child born, every wound healed was a triumph against overwhelming odds. The frontier, in its unrelenting reality, reminded every settler that life was precious, fragile, and fleeting. It demanded courage, patience, and vigilance. It required that every human being become both caretaker and observer, healer and learner. And in this daily confrontation with mortality, the people of the West developed a profound respect for life, a deep awareness of its fragility, and a quiet resilience that became the backbone of frontier society. In the dim light of evening, with the wind whispering through the grass and the occasional cry of an animal in the distance, families gathered close. They held each other, whispered words of comfort, and carried the knowledge that the frontier tested every aspect of existence, body, mind, and spirit. And through the endless challenges, they endured, crafting a life in which survival was a testament to courage, ingenuity, and the enduring strength of human connection. Life on the frontier was defined by work, unyielding, unrelenting, and often exhausting. Each day was a negotiation with time, nature, and necessity, a rhythm dictated by sun, soil, and survival. There were no shortcuts, no respite from responsibility. Every person, child, adult, or elder, had a role, and each task mattered, not for pride or recognition, but for the basic fact of staying alive and ensuring that those around them survived as well. The morning began early, often before dawn, with the pale light filtering through cabin windows. Farmers lifted buckets of water from wells, milking cows, tending chickens, preparing breakfast, and readying tools for the day's labor. Children swept floors, gathered kindling, and carried messages or supplies. The routine was exhausting, yet essential. Every chore was an investment in survival, every action a thread in the fragile web of sustenance. In the fields, planting and tending crops was a task both physically demanding and uncertain. Soil had to be broken with hand tools, seeds carefully sown, weeds pulled, pests chased away, and irrigation improvised from nearby streams. Work continued regardless of weather, driven by the urgent knowledge that a single failed crop could threaten the family's food supply for months. The land demanded attention, patience, and skill. It was unforgiving, but responsive to human effort when approached with care and diligence. Ranchers faced a different set of challenges. Herding cattle across miles of prairie required stamina, awareness, and courage. Horses had to be cared for, corrals repaired, and fences mended constantly. Stampedes were a persistent threat, capable of destroying weeks of work in minutes. Ranchers moved with both caution and confidence, learning the subtle rhythms of animal behavior and the moods of the land. Night brought its own dangers: predators stalking livestock, rustlers seeking opportunity, weather shifting suddenly. Each hour demanded vigilance, each day required endurance. Miners descended into shafts and tunnels, tools in hand, their muscles strained, lungs filled with dust. The rhythm of work was punctuated by the sound of pickaxes striking rock, the scraping of carts along rails, and the occasional clink of metal against stone. The promise of precious metals drove effort, but the work was physically punishing, dangerous, and poorly compensated. Cave-ins, gas pockets, and fatigue were constant companions. Success was rare, but even the smallest finds sustained hope, maintained morale, and justified the daily toll on the body and spirit. Domestic labor was equally unceasing. Women and girls cooked, cleaned, sewed, tended gardens, and cared for children and the sick. Laundry was washed in cold streams, clothes mended by hand, food prepared from scratch. Meals required long hours of preparation, grinding grain, churning butter, preserving meat and vegetables. Every action demanded focus, and mistakes could carry consequences far beyond inconvenience. Illness, scarcity, or spoilage threatened the delicate balance of survival, reminding settlers that every detail mattered. Even leisure was constrained by necessity. Storytelling, music, and communal gatherings were brief, treasured interludes in days packed with labor. They provided emotional sustenance, a way to nurture community bonds, to teach children, to share knowledge, and to find small moments of joy amid the relentless work. Humor, song, and quiet reflection became lifelines, grounding individuals in shared experience and memory. Social structure and hierarchy were fluid, shaped by skill, endurance, and necessity rather than wealth or birth. Those who could work effectively, who understood the land, who mastered tools and animals, gained respect and influence. Collaboration was essential, whether in planting a field, driving a herd, or repairing a building. Isolation magnified the consequences of failure, and cooperation, however uneasy, was a means of survival. The West demanded resilience not just in physical labor but in spirit and thought. Settlers learned to anticipate problems, improvise solutions, and persist despite repeated setbacks. Tools broke, weather shifted, animals strayed, illness struck, yet life went on. Every laborious day honed skills, built endurance, and strengthened the bonds between families and neighbors. Success was never guaranteed, but experience, wisdom, and perseverance created a foundation for life that could endure even the harshest circumstances. As the sun descended, painting the horizon in warm hues of amber and rose, the settlers paused. Tools were set aside, animals fed and sheltered, children gathered, and a shared meal became a quiet celebration of endurance. The day's labor, measured not only in productivity but in survival itself, brought a sense of accomplishment, however small. Each night, families slept knowing they had faced the challenges of the day, endured them, and prepared to face another dawn with courage, skill, and determination. On the frontier, work was life itself. The rhythms of labor dictated every aspect of existence, shaping character, community, and identity. Every task, no matter how small, carried weight. Every effort mattered. The frontier was a place where endurance, diligence, and human ingenuity met the unyielding demands of the land, and through this relentless labor, the people of the West wrote their own story, a story of survival, resilience, and the quiet heroism of everyday life. The frontier was a land of immense distances and profound solitude. Families were often separated by miles of plains, rivers, or mountains. Neighbors could be hours or days away, connected only by winding trails, infrequent letters, or the occasional rider bringing news. Isolation was both physical and psychological. The vastness of the land amplified the quiet, the emptiness, and the awareness that help could be far beyond reach. Loneliness became an intimate companion, shaping the rhythm of daily life. Settlers learned to live with it, to speak softly to themselves, to find comfort in routine, and to observe the world in minute detail. The wind across the prairie, the slow arc of the sun, the subtle changes in the landscape, all became part of the fabric of awareness. Attention to detail was necessary not only for survival but for mental endurance. In solitude, the mind expanded into the quiet spaces, learning to navigate fear, uncertainty, and the subtle challenges of isolation. Yet isolation was rarely absolute. Humans are social creatures, and the frontier demanded connection. Communities, small though they were, became lifelines. Churches, schools, and town gatherings provided structure and a sense of belonging. Social bonds were built on shared labor, mutual aid, and the tacit understanding that survival often depended on cooperation. When neighbors helped to repair a roof, chase off predators, or tend the sick, they were participating in a system of interdependence essential to the persistence of life in the West. Friendship and camaraderie were forged through shared labor, shared hardship, and shared danger. Children grew together, learning skills and stories from one another, absorbing lessons in trust, negotiation, and resilience. Adults negotiated relationships with equal care, balancing cooperation with caution, kindness with pragmatism. Respect was earned, not assumed. Alliances were practical as well as social. A neighbor's support could mean the difference between surviving a storm or succumbing to its fury. Isolation heightened awareness of subtle signals. Changes in weather, the approach of animals, or the behavior of fellow humans. It forced settlers to become attuned to the rhythms of the land, the moods of livestock, and the nuances of human behavior. In this attunement, they discovered knowledge and strength they could not have cultivated in comfort or abundance. Each day of solitude honed perception, endurance, and the ability to act decisively when necessity demanded. Yet the emotional cost was real. Letters from distant family, rare visits, or passing travelers brought relief and connection, yet often also reminded settlers of what was absent: the wider world, lost opportunities, or loved ones left behind. Journals and diaries became tools of expression, allowing thoughts and fears to be given shape. Songs, stories, and prayers offered solace, carrying both individual and communal memory across the open landscape. Even within isolation, the human need for companionship persisted. Gatherings at town centers, impromptu celebrations, communal meals, and cooperative labor projects became anchors in a world that could feel vast and unending. In these moments, stories were exchanged, knowledge shared, and culture sustained. Humor, storytelling, and music provided comfort, easing the weight of loneliness while reinforcing social cohesion. Isolation, then, was not solely a curse, but also a teacher. It sharpened skills, refined patience, and cultivated resilience. It demanded self-reliance, yet also underscored the importance of connection. The frontier taught that survival was both personal and collective, that enduring the land required not only physical labor and ingenuity but also emotional fortitude and the careful nurturing of human bonds. And so, as night fell across the prairie, as stars ignited the sky and the wind whispered through the grass, settlers gathered where they could, close to hearths, near neighbors, or beneath the vast expanse of the open sky. In these quiet moments, they carried the knowledge that life on the frontier demanded endurance in body, mind, and spirit. They survived because they adapted, because they worked, because they connected, because they persisted. In the delicate balance between isolation and community, between solitude and cooperation, the frontier revealed its profound truth, that life is fragile, that connection is vital, and that human resilience emerges most fully when challenged by both the vastness of the land and the necessity of shared existence. Each day endured, each night survived, each relationship nurtured, became part of the intricate, enduring fabric of frontier life, a testament to the courage, resourcefulness, and humanity of all who called the West their home. Food on the frontier was never merely a matter of preference, it was a matter of survival. Daily meals were dictated by availability, by the labor required to produce them, and by the unforgiving rhythms of nature. Settlers relied on the land, on animals, on preservation, and on ingenuity to sustain themselves, and each meal carried with it the weight of labor, scarcity, and the careful calculation of resources. Grains, corn, wheat, oats, formed the backbone of sustenance. Cornbread, simple loaves, porridge, and cakes were staples, prepared with the limited tools available. Every kernel was precious, every meal a product of cultivation, storage, and labor. Failure to protect or properly prepare grain could mean hunger, malnutrition, or worse. Vegetables, often grown in small family gardens, supplemented the diet. Beans, carrots, cabbage, and potatoes were common, planted in carefully tilled rows and protected from pests and drought. Seasonal cycles governed planting and harvest, requiring constant attention and labor. Preservation was essential. Drying, smoking, and pickling allowed families to survive the long, harsh winters when fresh food was unavailable. Meat was less consistent, yet critical for protein. Hunting provided game, from rabbits and deer to birds and small mammals. Fishing supplemented diet where streams and rivers were abundant. Livestock, cows, pigs, chickens, offered milk, eggs, and meat, but required daily care, feeding, and protection. Losses to predators, disease, or accident could devastate a family's food supply, making vigilance essential. Nutrition was limited, and deficiencies were common. Scurvy, rickets, and other diet-related illnesses occurred frequently, a reminder of the precariousness of frontier sustenance. Meals were repetitive, often monotonous, yet settlers adapted, drawing on available resources and creativity to maintain energy and strength. Herbs from the surrounding land were used for flavor, medicine, and preservation, blending utility with necessity. Preparation was laborious. Corn had to be ground into meal, beans soaked, vegetables chopped and cooked over wood fires. Preservation required careful attention to prevent spoilage. Every effort consumed time and energy, yet it was indispensable for survival. Children learned early to assist, understanding that every contribution, from fetching water to tending a garden, was a crucial element in the family's sustenance. Water, too, demanded care. Wells, streams, and collected rainwater were the sources of drinking, cooking, and cleaning. Contamination could bring disease, making vigilance essential. Water had to be boiled when possible, stored carefully, and rationed during dry periods. Even in the simplest tasks, settlers faced the ongoing challenge of safeguarding the basic necessities of life. Food was also a social and emotional anchor. Meals were moments of gathering, of communication, and of shared experience. The aroma of bread baking, the taste of fresh milk, the warmth of a stew at day's end, these small comforts reminded families of their resilience and their shared humanity. In scarcity, the act of eating together reinforced bonds, nurtured hope, and provided the emotional sustenance necessary to face another day of toil. Hunting expeditions, communal butchering, and shared gardens became a form of cooperation, a recognition that survival was seldom an individual achievement. Knowledge of the land, the seasons, and local wildlife was passed between families, neighbors, and travelers. Every plant, animal, and resource was observed, catalogued, and used with care, reflecting a deep understanding of the delicate balance between life and the environment. Despite the hardships, settlers cultivated creativity and adaptation. Recipes were improvised, tools repurposed, and wild foods incorporated. Canning, smoking, drying, and pickling transformed fleeting abundance into enduring sustenance. Each meal, though simple, represented triumph over scarcity, labor, and uncertainty. It was both necessity and achievement, nourishment and survival. And as the day ended, with exhausted bodies gathered around simple tables, with the wind whispering across fields and the sun dipping behind distant mountains, settlers reflected, often without words, on the cycle of labor and reward. Each bite of food was earned, each meal a testament to endurance, foresight, and the quiet triumph of human ingenuity. In the frontier's harsh environment, food was more than nourishment. It was survival, connection, and a daily assertion of life in the face of relentless challenge. The struggle for sustenance shaped every aspect of existence on the frontier. It demanded cooperation, patience, and resilience. It tested human ingenuity, endurance, and adaptability. And in meeting this challenge, settlers not only survived, they forged a life, a culture, and a story that would endure long after the dust of the plains settled, long after the echoes of daily labor faded, as a testament to the human capacity to thrive even in the harshest and most unforgiving of landscapes. The American frontier was a land of encounter, a meeting point of diverse cultures, beliefs, and livelihoods. Yet for Native American nations, this encounter often brought profound disruption, displacement, and cultural upheaval. For generations, these peoples had cultivated complex societies, rich with tradition, ceremony, and understanding of the land. The westward expansion of settlers, miners, ranchers, and soldiers challenged that existence in ways both immediate and enduring. Displacement was relentless. Treaties, often negotiated under duress or broken by the United States government, moved tribes from ancestral lands to reservations. These lands were frequently marginal, unsuitable for traditional agriculture, hunting, or lifestyle. The natural rhythms that had guided generations, the migration of bison, the seasonal cycles of planting and gathering, the sacred spaces of ceremony, were disrupted. Survival became dependent on adaptation to imposed conditions, which often included limited resources, harsh climates, and restrictions on mobility. Cultural collision extended beyond physical displacement. Indigenous peoples confronted settlers' languages, laws, and customs, which conflicted with their own governance, spirituality, and social norms. Religious ceremonies, trade systems, and community structures were undermined, often deliberately. Boarding schools sought to erase language, traditions, and identity, teaching children to adopt foreign ways and view their own heritage as inferior. Generations were affected, and the trauma of these efforts rippled across families and communities. Violence was frequent, though rarely romanticized. Armed conflicts, raids, and skirmishes marked the landscape. Both sides endured casualties, yet the imbalance of power favored settlers armed with government backing, rifles, and technological advantage. Native Americans defended their homes, livelihoods, and families, yet the relentless advance of settlements, railroads, and military forts forced many into compromise or surrender. The consequences were profound: loss of life, erosion of traditional practices, and the fracturing of communities. Despite this upheaval, resilience endured. Native American nations preserved knowledge, language, and rituals in secret or adapted them to new circumstances. Ceremonies, oral histories, and art became vessels for memory and identity, ensuring that even in displacement, the essence of culture could survive. Leadership, diplomacy, and negotiation were exercised with wisdom, often in the face of extreme adversity. Individuals and communities demonstrated ingenuity, patience, and fortitude, navigating a world reshaped by forces beyond their control. The collision was not one-sided. Settlers, too, were forced to adapt, learning from indigenous knowledge about the land, flora, fauna, and survival techniques. Trade networks, cultural exchange, and cooperation sometimes emerged alongside tension and conflict. The frontier was thus a space of both collision and convergence, of tragedy and learning, shaping the evolving social and cultural landscape. Every day brought challenges. Hunting grounds were restricted, water sources commandeered, and traditional migration patterns interrupted. Food scarcity became common as bison herds were hunted to near extinction and land previously abundant with natural resources became dominated by settlers and livestock. Health crises arose as new diseases, introduced by outsiders, spread among native populations, for which immunity was often lacking. Families faced impossible choices, balancing the preservation of tradition with immediate survival. Children grew up in this tense environment, learning lessons of endurance, adaptability, and vigilance. Elders became repositories of knowledge and resilience, instructing younger generations in the skills and stories necessary to maintain identity. Art, music, and ritual acted as both solace and strategy, providing continuity amidst profound disruption. The frontier's vastness, while offering opportunity to settlers, also highlighted the scale of loss and struggle for native communities. Sacred lands were fenced off, migration routes blocked, and survival strategies challenged at every turn. And yet, across this struggle, cultural continuity persisted. Knowledge was hidden, adapted, and carried forward. Community bonds, kinship, and shared memory became lifelines, sustaining peoples whose lives had been upended by forces both legal and violent. The story of the frontier is thus incomplete without acknowledging this dimension, the profound impact of displacement, cultural collision, and resilience. Survival was not solely a matter of labor or ingenuity, but of endurance in the face of societal upheaval. It was a test of identity, adaptability, and the human spirit, as Native Americans navigated a world increasingly dictated by outsiders yet remained steadfast in preserving the essence of their heritage. Through loss and adaptation, the frontier was a crucible of endurance for all who lived upon it. For Native Americans, the struggle was existential, shaping the trajectory of communities, culture, and identity for generations to come. Their story is inseparable from the broader narrative of the West, a reminder that the frontier was not only a land of opportunity but also a site of profound disruption, resilience, and enduring human complexity. Law on the frontier was a fragile, uneven construct, often more a concept than a reality. Towns sprang up quickly, and formal law enforcement was slow to follow. Sheriffs, marshals, and deputies were sometimes the only authority in vast, sparsely populated areas, responsible for miles of territory with minimal resources. The challenges were immense. Crime was opportunistic, disputes were frequent, and the thin veneer of order was easily disrupted by chance, passion, or necessity. Vigilantism was common. In the absence of structured enforcement, settlers often took justice into their own hands. Mob action, public shaming, and swift, extrajudicial punishment were responses to theft, assault, or disputes over land and livestock. These actions were rarely formalized or predictable. What one community accepted as justice might be seen elsewhere as arbitrary or cruel. The frontier, in this sense, was a place where law and morality were constantly negotiated, shaped by practical necessity and social consensus rather than codified statutes. Gunfights, the legendary quick-draw duels immortalized in dime novels and later Hollywood films, were rare. Most violent confrontations were spontaneous, fueled by alcohol, personal grievances, or disputes over resources. They were chaotic, often brutal, and almost never staged or ceremonial. Accidents were common. Injuries were severe. Fatalities were frequent. These confrontations reinforced the perception of the frontier as dangerous but rarely resembled the dramatic spectacles later imagined in popular culture. Crime was pervasive yet contextually bound. Theft of livestock, rustling, and disputes over water or land were daily challenges. Miners quarreled over claims, ranchers over pastures, settlers over boundaries. The legal system often lagged behind, leaving individuals and communities to resolve conflicts themselves. Courts were distant, underfunded, or biased toward those with influence or wealth. Justice was not guaranteed, and fairness was fragile. Survival often depended on one's reputation, ability to negotiate, and willingness to defend oneself. Punishments were harsh. Floggings, public humiliation, imprisonment in rudimentary jails, and even lynching were employed as deterrence and retribution. While some actions were motivated by a desire to maintain order, others were driven by fear, prejudice, or vengeance. The line between justice and cruelty was thin. Every decision carried risk, not only for the accused but also for the community and those charged with maintaining peace. Law enforcement faced limitations. Sheriffs patrolled on horseback, deputies were few, and communication with distant authorities was slow. Crime often moved faster than law could respond. Patrols were reactive rather than proactive, and the capacity to prevent violence was minimal. Community participation was essential. Neighbors watched one another's property, reported suspicious activity, and occasionally banded together to confront threats. Survival and security depended on vigilance, cooperation, and sometimes the willingness to enforce rules personally. Social norms played a critical role. Respect, reputation, and relationships shaped behavior. Individuals who earned trust and demonstrated competence or courage wielded informal authority, influencing decisions and mediating disputes. Communities relied as much on these social structures as on formal legal institutions. Informal networks of accountability maintained order where formal law could not, illustrating the adaptive strategies necessary in a sparsely populated, often chaotic environment. The myth of the frontier as a place of unbridled heroism and moral clarity obscured these realities. Violence was rarely gallant. Justice was rarely impartial. Alcohol, poverty, and desperation fueled conflicts, while survival required constant negotiation, vigilance, and careful judgment. Dime novels and later films transformed these messy, improvisational realities into stories of clean, dramatic confrontations between clear heroes and villains. In truth, life was far more complex, morally ambiguous, situational, and shaped by the constant pressures of scarcity and danger. Even ordinary residents, who sought only to farm, trade, or maintain a household, lived under this shadow. Awareness of potential theft, assault, or sudden violence shaped daily routines. Children learned early to respect authority, recognize danger, and act prudently. Women, men, and elders alike negotiated routines and behaviors that balanced daily work with vigilance. Every decision carried weight because consequences were immediate and sometimes severe. Ultimately, frontier justice was a reflection of the land itself, harsh, uneven, and demanding endurance, ingenuity, and courage. It was a system shaped by circumstance, necessity, and human will rather than lawbooks or government decree. Understanding this reality offers a deeper comprehension of the frontier, not as a place of glamorous duels or noble outlaws, but as a complex, precarious society where survival and morality were intimately intertwined, and where the resilience of individuals and communities determined the fragile balance between order and chaos. As dust settled over towns, saloons emptied, and shadows stretched across wooden streets, the people of the West understood the delicate balance they navigated daily. They survived not because of myths, but because of vigilance, pragmatism, and an unwavering awareness that life was as unpredictable as the land itself. The frontier demanded adaptation, courage, and constant negotiation, and those who endured learned, slowly, the intricate dance of law, justice, and survival. Life on the frontier demanded more than physical endurance. It required constant negotiation with the economic realities of scarcity, risk, and uncertainty. Every laborer, whether miner, rancher, or farmer, was entangled in a web of economic pressures that shaped their daily existence, often with consequences as unforgiving as the land itself. Miners, drawn by the promise of gold, silver, or other precious resources, confronted daily dangers that dwarfed potential reward. Tunnels were dark, unstable, and claustrophobic. Cave-ins, toxic gas, and flooding were ever-present threats. Tools were rudimentary, and protective measures minimal. The work was grueling, performed with aching muscles, strained lungs, and constant vigilance. Yet even the successful discovery of or did not guarantee wealth. Claims were contested, machinery was expensive, and distant markets determined the value of extracted materials. Many miners toiled endlessly, earning barely enough to survive, their bodies and spirits worn down by relentless labor. Ranchers faced a different but equally precarious economic reality. Cattle drives, herding, and livestock management demanded skill, endurance, and constant attention. Weather could destroy crops and pastures, disease could decimate herds, rustlers and predators threatened months of work in a single night. Market prices fluctuated unpredictably, leaving ranchers vulnerable to financial ruin despite tireless effort. Success required not only labor but foresight, negotiation, and a profound understanding of both animals and land. Farmers, often settling marginal land, contended with soil quality, climate variability, and the constant threat of pests. Every plow, every planting season, every harvest carried the weight of survival. A failed crop could mean hunger, debt, or displacement. Innovations in tools and techniques provided some relief, yet labor remained intensive and reward uncertain. Families worked together from dawn to dusk, breaking soil, tending animals, repairing buildings, and preserving food. Even small achievements were measured against the relentless demands of the environment and the market. Wage labor offered little security. Construction, logging, and railroad work were physically punishing and poorly compensated. Miners, ranch hands, and farm laborers were often at the mercy of employers, with long hours, low pay, and unsafe conditions. Accidents were common, medical care minimal, and unemployment could quickly lead to destitution. Economic survival demanded constant labor, adaptability, and a readiness to endure hardship with limited recourse. Scarcity permeated all aspects of frontier life. Supplies were expensive or difficult to obtain, tools and equipment required maintenance or improvisation, food was often monotonous and nutritionally inadequate. Money circulated unevenly, and barter remained common. Settlers learned to stretch resources, repurpose materials, and improvise solutions, creating a culture of ingenuity born of necessity. Despite these hardships, economic activity forged community, connection, and resilience. Miners pooled labor and shared information about claims. Farmers exchanged seeds, tools, and knowledge. Ranchers collaborated on drives and fencing. Trade networks developed, linking settlements and towns, creating patterns of interdependence. These networks not only supported survival but also laid the groundwork for social cohesion and cultural continuity in a harsh, often unforgiving environment. Economic pressure also shaped social hierarchies. Success, rare and tenuous, conferred status and influence, while failure demanded humility, resilience, and adaptation. Individuals and families learned to navigate the delicate balance of risk and reward, of labor and leisure, of hope and despair. Every decision carried consequences, and the cumulative effects of these decisions defined the structure, culture, and identity of frontier society. The harsh realities of labor, scarcity, and risk were inseparable from the mythology of the West. Dime novels and later films celebrated the heroism of the solitary cowboy, the miner striking gold, the rancher conquering the plains. In reality, daily survival was less dramatic, more grueling, and far more contingent on cooperation, endurance, and adaptability. The frontier was a place where perseverance mattered more than luck, where skill mattered more than glamour, and where ordinary people carried the extraordinary burden of sustaining life in an unforgiving land. As the sun set behind mountains, illuminating dust and sweat-streaked faces, laborers rested briefly, tending animals, repairing tools, or sharing a simple meal. The economic struggle was ongoing, relentless, and defining. It shaped not only material existence but character, relationships, and the very rhythm of life. Survival depended on endurance, ingenuity, and the quiet courage to persist day after day, season after season, against the unpredictable and often unforgiving demands of frontier life. And so, economic hardship, labor, and scarcity became intertwined with the identity of the West. They were as formative as the land itself, molding the people who lived there, the communities they built, and the legacy they left. The frontier was not merely a place of mythic adventure. It was a crucible of survival, resilience, and human endeavor, where every day's labor, every risk, and every choice contributed to the ongoing story of life on the American frontier. Life on the frontier was a delicate balance, and health was among the most precarious of commodities. Disease was constant, silent, and often swift, a shadow that stalked the living even as they labored and endured. Infections that seem minor today, a scraped knee, a cough, a stomachache, could become fatal, amplified by poor sanitation, limited resources, and the harsh realities of the environment. Medical knowledge was rudimentary. Trained doctors were scarce, and those who practiced often relied on experience, observation, and folk remedies more than scientifically proven methods. Herbs, poultices, and untested concoctions were common, and while sometimes effective, they often caused more harm than good. Surgery without anesthesia or sterilization carried high risk, infections were frequent, and amputation was often the only recourse for injury. Simple childbirth could become a life-threatening ordeal for both mother and child, and maternal mortality was tragically high. Communicable diseases, smallpox, influenza, measles, cholera, and tuberculosis spread rapidly, especially in crowded towns, mining camps, and boarding schools. Quarantines were difficult to enforce, and remedies were limited. Survivors were often those with fortitude, resources, or sheer luck. Epidemics could devastate communities, leaving behind grief, scarcity, and a stark reminder of human vulnerability. Nutrition, or the lack thereof, compounded these challenges. Diets were monotonous, seasonal, and often deficient in essential vitamins and minerals. Malnutrition weakened resistance to illness, slowed recovery, and heightened susceptibility to infection. Families relied on preserved food, game, and garden produce, yet scarcity and environmental unpredictability often meant hunger was only a temporary reprieve from illness. Mental health, too, suffered in isolation and adversity. The stress of constant labor, threat of violence, social displacement, and environmental hardship weighed heavily on individuals. Anxiety, depression, and exhaustion were common, yet largely unrecognized or untreated. Community support, rituals, and religion offered solace, but the psychological toll of frontier life was a constant, silent companion. Settlers improvised solutions where formal medicine failed. Midwives, herbalists, and experienced elders were invaluable, passing down remedies, techniques, and knowledge honed through observation and necessity. Makeshift hospitals appeared during epidemics. Travelers and neighboring towns shared resources and expertise. Despite these efforts, mortality remained high, and the fragility of life was a daily reality. Children were especially vulnerable. Infectious diseases, malnutrition, accidents, and exposure claimed many at a young age. Survivors often bore the physical and emotional marks of early adversity, their endurance shaped by necessity and circumstance. Families learned to navigate this precarious world with a mixture of vigilance, improvisation, and hope, understanding that even the smallest lapse could carry profound consequences. Animals, too, were sources of both sustenance and illness. Livestock carried disease, water sources were contaminated by waste, and insect-borne illnesses spread silently. Cleanliness was difficult to maintain, and yet every effort, from boiling water to washing clothes in streams, was a fight against vulnerability. The line between life and death was thin, defined by careful observation, timely intervention, and a measure of fortune. Despite these challenges, the human spirit endured. Settlers found courage in small victories: a child's recovery, a successful harvest enabling proper nutrition, or the alleviation of suffering through a known remedy. They adapted, observed, and persevered, cultivating knowledge and resilience that would be passed to future generations. Health was fragile, but determination and resourcefulness offered a measure of protection against the ever-present threats. The frontier was thus a world where every cough, every wound, every fever carried weight. Where each laborer's physical strength, each family's vigilance, and each community's cooperation could determine survival. Life was a testament to resilience in the face of relentless adversity, a delicate balance maintained through ingenuity, endurance, and the quiet courage to face uncertainty each day. In understanding frontier health, we glimpse not only the physical challenges of the era but the extraordinary fortitude of those who lived through them. They navigated a landscape where disease and injury were omnipresent, where care was improvised, and where survival demanded vigilance, knowledge, and unwavering resilience. Each day lived was a triumph, each recovery a quiet victory, and each life sustained a testament to human endurance amid one of the harshest environments in history. The vastness of the American frontier imposed a profound sense of isolation, a solitude both physical and psychological. Communities were scattered, towns were distant, and the journey from one settlement to another could be measured in days or weeks. Transportation was not merely a convenience, it was a lifeline, a bridge across the emptiness, a conduit for goods, communication, and survival. Covered wagons, the iconic symbols of migration, carried families, tools, and supplies across plains, deserts, and mountain passes. Every journey was fraught with challenge: rough terrain, unpredictable weather, broken equipment, and the constant threat of injury or attack. Families rode together, each member performing vital tasks, guiding animals, tending the fire, navigating, or keeping watch, every hour of the journey demanding vigilance and endurance. Stagecoaches and horseback riders connected towns and settlements. They delivered letters, news, and travelers, linking isolated communities with the broader world. Roads were often little more than dirt paths, impassable after rain or snow. Bridges were rare, rivers had to be forded with care. Travel could be slow, exhausting, and dangerous, yet it was essential for commerce, communication, and the maintenance of social bonds. Isolation affected every facet of life. Social interaction was limited, opportunities for trade, entertainment, and assistance were rare. Loneliness was common, particularly during harsh winters or extended journeys. Settlers developed routines, rituals, and coping mechanisms to endure the solitude. Storytelling, music, and communal labor became vital. The psychological burden of isolation compounded the physical challenges, making resilience a necessity. Rivers and waterways served as natural highways, where boats and ferries moved goods and people. Yet even these routes had hazards: shifting currents, seasonal flooding, and limited navigational aids. Each voyage required skill, attention, and adaptation to unpredictable conditions. Waterways were both life-sustaining and treacherous, demanding respect and careful planning. Railroads, emerging in the mid-19th century, transformed transportation profoundly. Tracks linked distant towns, enabled the shipment of resources to markets, and facilitated migration. Yet the railroad's impact was double-edged. While it offered opportunity and connection, it also accelerated corporate influence, land speculation, and the encroachment on Native American territories. The expansion of rail lines reshaped the physical and social landscape, redefining distance, accessibility, and the dynamics of frontier life. Supply chains were fragile. Distant settlements depended on periodic deliveries of food, tools, and medicine. Delays could mean hunger, illness, or economic disruption. Settlers learned to anticipate scarcity, store essentials, and improvise solutions when shipments were late or lost. Preparation, foresight, and resourcefulness were constant requirements, and failures carried immediate consequences. Travel was also dangerous. Bandits, wild animals, and accidents posed daily threats. Horses could falter, wagons could overturn, and travelers could become lost in unfamiliar terrain. Knowledge of the land, passed down through experience or shared in the sparse communities, was invaluable. Survival depended on skill, patience, and a keen understanding of both the natural world and human unpredictability. Despite the hardships, transportation linked the frontier's scattered communities, sustaining the fragile threads of society. It enabled commerce, fostered relationships, and allowed information to flow across vast expanses. For families, these lifelines meant access to medical care, trade goods, and news from distant relatives. For towns, it facilitated economic growth, social cohesion, and cultural exchange. The frontier's lifelines were both practical and symbolic. They represented connection, opportunity, and the tenuous link between human endeavor and the expansive, often unforgiving landscape. Every journey, every wagon wheel turned, and every hoofbeat carried significance beyond movement. It was a statement of endurance, of human ingenuity, and of the relentless determination to survive and thrive in a world defined by distance, isolation, and constant challenge. In understanding transportation on the frontier, we recognize not merely the movement of people and goods but the intricate interplay between geography, human ambition, and survival. It shaped patterns of settlement, economic activity, and cultural exchange, leaving an indelible mark on the land and the people who traversed it. Each journey across the frontier was a testament to resilience, courage, and the enduring human spirit in the face of isolation and adversity. Life on the frontier was not defined solely by hardship. It was also shaped by human connection, community, and ritual. In the face of environmental extremes, economic pressure, and isolation, settlers forged social structures and routines that provided both practical support and emotional sustenance. Daily life was a delicate balance of labor, cooperation, and shared experience, where survival and social cohesion were inseparable. Work dominated the day, yet even amidst toil, people sought moments of connection. Families collaborated in labor, plowing fields, tending livestock, repairing homes, and preparing food, creating bonds strengthened by necessity. Children were active participants, learning skills essential for survival while forming relationships and networks that would sustain them into adulthood. Every shared task reinforced the interdependence that allowed communities to endure. Churches, schools, and community gatherings served as critical centers of social life. Religious services provided solace, structure, and moral guidance, while schools offered education and a rare opportunity for children to engage with peers. Festivals, dances, and communal meals punctuated the rhythm of labor, offering respite and celebration. These gatherings, though infrequent, reinforced a sense of belonging, identity, and continuity in a world otherwise defined by uncertainty. Neighbors were lifelines. Assistance in emergencies, illness, injury, or natural disaster was often provided by nearby families. Bartering, trade, and the sharing of tools, livestock, or produce created informal networks of mutual support. Reputation, trust, and reciprocity were currency as vital as money, forming the foundation of social cohesion in isolated settlements. Cooperation was not merely benevolent, it was essential for survival, an adaptive strategy in an environment where resources and help were limited. Gender roles were defined yet flexible, shaped by necessity and circumstance. Women performed labor beyond domestic chores, assisting in farming, tending animals, and contributing to economic ventures. Men engaged in construction, mining, and transport but often participated in domestic or communal tasks when circumstances demanded. Children learned early to assume responsibility, blurring lines between play and work, education and survival. Every contribution mattered, creating a social fabric resilient to the strains of frontier life. Leisure was modest yet meaningful. Storytelling, music, and informal games provided both entertainment and instruction, passing knowledge, values, and traditions. Oral histories preserved memories of migration, settlement, and survival, ensuring that cultural identity endured even in the absence of formal institutions. Humor, camaraderie, and shared experience became vital tools for coping with stress, isolation, and adversity. Health and hygiene shaped social routines as well. Communities organized water collection, waste disposal, and firewood gathering, recognizing that collective action could mitigate risk. Mothers and elders imparted knowledge about home remedies, nutrition, and first aid, teaching younger generations the skills required to maintain well-being in a challenging environment. These practices intertwined with ritual, ceremony, and shared belief, reflecting a holistic approach to daily life where practical and spiritual concerns coexisted. Conflict existed, of course, arising from scarcity, differing values, or personal grievances. Yet communities often developed mechanisms to manage disputes: mediation by elders, negotiation among neighbors, or reliance on social norms and reputations. These informal systems of justice maintained equilibrium where formal law was weak or absent, emphasizing the adaptive intelligence and social sophistication of frontier settlements. Even amidst hardship, celebrations persisted. Weddings, births, and harvest festivals punctuated the calendar, providing joy, ritual, and continuity. Music, dance, and communal meals reinforced social bonds, instilling hope and resilience. These moments of festivity were more than diversion. They were affirmations of life, shared identity, and human perseverance, highlighting that even in a world of scarcity, celebration, and cultural expression were vital. Food preparation and communal meals were central to both survival and social cohesion. Families cooked together, shared surplus, and preserved provisions for lean periods. Recipes blended necessity with tradition, reflecting cultural influences from diverse settlers and indigenous knowledge. Meals became occasions for storytelling, instruction, and reinforcing kinship ties, linking nourishment with social and emotional sustenance. In essence, the frontier's social life was a dynamic interplay of labor, ritual, cooperation, and adaptation. Community structures, formal and informal, enabled survival, transmitted culture, and fostered resilience. Isolation magnified the importance of each connection. Every neighbor, every family, every act of mutual support carried profound significance. Through daily routines, shared labor, and communal rituals, settlers cultivated networks that transformed scattered individuals into cohesive societies, capable of enduring the relentless challenges of the American West. The rhythm of frontier life, work, ritual, cooperation, celebration, created a framework for human endurance. In this context, resilience was social as well as individual. People survived not merely by laboring tirelessly or confronting dangers alone, but by weaving networks of trust, support, and shared knowledge. Life on the frontier demanded that every interaction, every routine, every small act of care be imbued with purpose, because survival was never solely a matter of individual effort but a communal endeavor. In understanding the social fabric of the frontier, we recognize that human connection, ritual, and cooperation were as vital as skill, strength, and courage. The frontier's enduring lessons are not only of hardship but of adaptability, empathy, and the profound capacity of communities to sustain life, culture, and identity under conditions that tested the limits of endurance and imagination. The American frontier was a tapestry of cultures, a complex mosaic shaped by migration, settlement, and the interactions of peoples from across continents. Far from a homogeneous society, the West was home to Native Americans, European settlers, African Americans, Mexican communities, and Chinese immigrants, among others. Each group brought traditions, skills, and knowledge that contributed to survival and adaptation, yet each faced challenges shaped by prejudice, conflict, and environmental hardship. Native Americans, the original inhabitants, confronted displacement, disease, and systemic efforts to erase their cultural identities. Treaties were often broken, land was seized, and traditional ways of life were forcibly interrupted. Despite these pressures, Native communities resisted, adapted, and persisted, preserving language, rituals, and social structures in the face of extraordinary adversity. Their knowledge of the land, tracking, hunting, and farming techniques became essential to the survival of settlers, even as indigenous people themselves were marginalized. Chinese immigrants played a pivotal role in labor-intensive industries. They built railroads, mined, farmed, and worked in service trades. They faced harsh discrimination, violence, and legal barriers, yet their contributions were indispensable to economic development. Communities formed within towns and camps, maintaining cultural practices, language, and cuisine, creating pockets of identity in an often hostile environment. African Americans, including former enslaved people and their descendants, sought new opportunities in the West. Many became cowboys, laborers, and homesteaders, navigating both economic hardship and systemic racism. Their skills, ingenuity, and resilience shaped the development of frontier life, yet their stories were often overlooked, their contributions minimized in myth and popular culture. European immigrants brought agricultural knowledge, trades, and craft skills. German, Irish, Scandinavian, and Italian settlers, among others, transformed land through farming, construction, and community organization. They created enclaves of cultural practice, festivals, and religious observance, integrating elements of their heritage into the evolving frontier society. Each wave of immigration added new layers of tradition, expertise, and adaptation. Mexican Americans maintained traditions shaped by centuries of settlement in the Southwest. Ranching, irrigation, and culinary practices reflected a deep understanding of arid environments. They endured land dispossession and legal challenges, yet their cultural imprint remained resilient, influencing architecture, law, cuisine, and social norms. Despite this richness, racial and ethnic hierarchies shaped interactions. Discrimination, segregation, and violence were widespread, often codified in local practices or enforced through community consensus. Immigrants and minority groups had to navigate a precarious balance of adaptation, survival, and resistance. Social mobility was constrained, and prejudice shaped access to resources, legal protection, and economic opportunity. Cultural exchange, however, was inevitable. Trade, labor collaboration, and social gatherings facilitated the sharing of knowledge and traditions. Culinary practices, agricultural techniques, and storytelling were exchanged, adapted, and integrated into frontier life. Even amidst conflict and inequality, the frontier functioned as a site of cultural negotiation, where survival demanded cooperation, understanding, and the blending of diverse practices. Religious, linguistic, and culinary traditions coexisted in the same town or settlement, each group preserving identity while adapting to frontier exigencies. Festivals, rituals, and shared labor became points of intersection, sometimes fraught with tension, sometimes infused with camaraderie. These interactions shaped the social fabric, creating a dynamic, evolving culture that was both contested and collaborative. For settlers and immigrants alike, the frontier was a place of opportunity tempered by risk. Economic necessity often overrode social divisions, compelling cooperation in mining, ranching, or communal projects. Shared exposure to environmental hazards, violence, and scarcity forged practical bonds that could transcend prejudice, if only temporarily. Yet underlying hierarchies and historical inequities persisted, shaping daily interactions, opportunities, and long-term outcomes. Understanding the cultural mosaic of the frontier requires acknowledging both contributions and injustices. It is a story of resilience, adaptation, and innovation, but also of exclusion, displacement, and marginalization. The frontier was a crucible where identities were tested, cultures were both preserved and transformed, and human endurance was shaped by interaction as much as by environment. In this complex interplay, the American West emerges not as a singular narrative of conquest or mythic heroism, but as a living tapestry of human diversity. Every family, laborer, and community contributed threads of experience, knowledge, and culture to the fabric of frontier society. These contributions, often overlooked in popular imagination, reveal a society defined by resilience, adaptation, and the continual negotiation of identity, survival, and opportunity. The legacy of this cultural diversity endures in architecture, law, food, music, and the very understanding of what it means to inhabit, adapt to, and survive in a challenging, often unforgiving landscape. The frontier's story is thus inseparable from the people who lived it, the cultures they carried, and the struggles and cooperation that shaped both their lives and the evolving identity of the American West. Violence on the frontier was pervasive, yet it was far removed from the stylized, heroic confrontations depicted in dime novels and Hollywood films. The imagined quick-draw gunfights, the duels at high noon, and the noble standoffs existed more in imagination than in reality. Instead, conflict was often impulsive, chaotic, and brutal, arising from scarcity, fear, alcohol, and cultural tensions. Law enforcement was limited, inconsistent, and frequently absent, leaving communities to navigate danger with little protection. Disputes over land, water, livestock, and resources fueled much of the violence. The frontier's loose social structures meant that personal grievances could escalate quickly. A property disagreement, an insult, or an act of theft might trigger a confrontation, and in a society where reputation mattered and formal justice was distant, personal retaliation was often the only recourse. These conflicts were rarely staged spectacles. They were messy, unpredictable, and deadly. Alcohol played a central role in both recreation and aggression. Saloons served as hubs of social life, trade, and leisure, but they were also catalysts for conflict. Intoxication combined with stress, fatigue, and social tension often led to fistfights, gunplay, or even murder. The line between celebration and danger was thin, and a simple evening of socializing could turn deadly in an instant. Native Americans faced a vastly different form of conflict: systemic violence, forced removal, and cultural suppression. Military campaigns, broken treaties, and encroaching settlements devastated indigenous communities. Violence was not random but deliberate, part of a broader policy of displacement and erasure. For native populations, survival required navigating both physical danger and profound social upheaval. Their resistance often met with overwhelming force. Criminal activity in frontier towns added another layer of instability. Bandits, thieves, and opportunists exploited the lack of formal law, targeting isolated homesteads, traveling wagons, and sparsely protected settlements. Vigilante justice became common, a double-edged sword where communities attempted to maintain order through informal, and sometimes violent, enforcement. Mob actions, lynchings, and impromptu trials reflected the precarious balance between survival, morality, and justice. Mining camps and transient settlements were particularly volatile. Miners, exhausted and desperate, often settled disputes violently. Camps lacked structured authority, and transient populations made long-term accountability rare. Personal courage, reputation, and alliances often determined one's safety more than law or principle. Work-related accidents, environmental hazards, and competition for claims heightened tensions, turning every day into a test of vigilance and endurance. Ranchers and farmers faced both human and natural threats. Rustlers, predators, and neighboring disputes could escalate into armed confrontation. The isolation of properties and the limited reach of law enforcement meant that self-reliance and defense were essential. Guns, horses, and alliances were not merely symbols but tools of survival. Yet even with preparation, chance and circumstance determined outcomes more than skill or valor. Misunderstandings between cultural groups also fueled conflict. Language barriers, differing legal traditions, and competing claims over land or water created friction. Efforts at negotiation were frequently undermined by mistrust or prejudice, resulting in sporadic violence. Yet these conflicts, while real, were often temporary, with practical necessity driving eventual cooperation and coexistence. Survival demanded that people negotiate, adapt, and sometimes forgive to maintain social and economic viability. In essence, frontier violence was not a spectacle, it was a function of the environment, scarcity, and social conditions. It was unpredictable, uneven, and often tragic. Heroism was rare. Endurance, adaptability, and prudence were far more valuable qualities than the quick draw or the perfect aim. Every settlement, every homestead, every town existed in a delicate balance between order and chaos, and the fragile thread of community could unravel in moments of conflict. The mythology of the West, gunfighters, outlaws, and lawmen, simplified this complexity into narratives of heroism and moral clarity. Yet reality was far more nuanced. Violence was messy, morally ambiguous, and deeply intertwined with survival, economic pressures, and cultural friction. Understanding this truth allows us to see the frontier not as a stage for legend, but as a landscape of human endurance, risk, and negotiation, where courage took many forms, often quiet and unseen. Conflict on the frontier, in all its forms, shaped behavior, governance, and culture. It defined relationships, informed strategies for survival, and left a legacy that persisted in the social memory of communities. The real story of violence is not one of cinematic heroism but of the daily navigation of danger, the reliance on community, and the constant calculation of risk in a world defined by scarcity, distance, and uncertainty. Every confrontation, every act of aggression, every measured restraint contributed to the ongoing adaptation of life on the frontier. In this crucible of danger, human resilience, judgment, and cooperation were tested, and those who endured shaped the social, cultural, and economic contours of the American West. Life on the frontier demanded unrelenting physical labor, and few arenas exemplified this better than farming and ranching. These were not merely occupations, they were daily battles against the land, weather, and relentless cycles of survival. Every dawn marked the beginning of an exhaustive routine, every sunset represented a brief reprieve before the next day's struggle. Farming was fraught with unpredictability. Soil was often thin, rocky, or poorly suited to crops. Settlers relied on simple tools: wooden plows, hand hoes, and scythes. Clearing land required cutting trees, removing stones, and breaking sod, a task that could take weeks for a single acre. Planting and tending crops demanded hours under the sun, exposure to wind, rain, and pests. Harvest time brought both reward and danger, as exhaustion, heat stroke, and injury were constant threats. Water was life, yet it was never guaranteed. Wells could dry up, streams could shift, and irrigation required ingenuity and persistence. Droughts could devastate crops. Floods could wash away months of labor in hours. Every season demanded vigilance, knowledge, and adaptability. Survival depended on the ability to anticipate, improvise, and endure, a lesson learned through trial, error, and relentless perseverance. Ranching brought its own challenges, equally demanding but of a different nature. Cattle drives, the backbone of the Western economy, exposed cowboys to physical exhaustion, harsh weather, and dangerous animals. Stampedes could occur without warning, threatening both life and property. Predators, disease among livestock, and theft posed daily risks. Cowboys rode long hours, often through rugged terrain, tending herds and repairing fences. Their labor was both physically punishing and crucial to sustaining economic life on the frontier. Families shared the burden. Women worked alongside men, tending gardens, managing livestock, and preparing food. Children contributed wherever possible, learning essential skills while carrying out chores that today would be considered adult labor. Every member of the household was engaged in the collective enterprise of survival, and every contribution had immediate consequences. Laziness or neglect could mean scarcity, illness, or failure. Weather was an ever-present adversary. Winters brought snow and frost, freezing crops, killing livestock, and making travel perilous. Summers were hot and dry, dehydrating workers and threatening yields. Storms could destroy buildings and fences, turning careful preparation into chaos. Frontier's people had to anticipate, endure, and recover continuously, their bodies molded by necessity into instruments of resilience and adaptability. Economic pressures amplified the toll. Land ownership, crop yield, and market access dictated survival. Even successful harvests or healthy herds did not guarantee stability. Fluctuating prices, distant markets, and competition from larger operators could negate months of labor. Minuscule margins demanded constant effort, careful planning, and unyielding diligence. There was little room for error, and the consequences of failure were immediate and severe. Physical injuries were commonplace. Blisters, burns, broken bones, and cuts were daily hazards, often compounded by limited access to medical care. Even minor injuries could become life-threatening if infected. Hard work combined with poor nutrition and fatigue weakened bodies over time, creating a cycle of strain, illness, and recovery that tested every individual's endurance. Yet despite these hardships, frontier labor fostered resilience, skill, and ingenuity. Settlers developed techniques to maximize yields, conserve water, and protect livestock. Innovations were shared through communities, passed down from one generation to the next. Knowledge of seasons, soil, animals, and tools became as vital as physical strength, creating a deep, practical wisdom born of necessity. The rhythm of labor was punctuated by small victories: a successful harvest, a calving without incident, a repaired fence before a storm. These moments were fleeting but essential, sustaining morale and reinforcing the value of hard work. They reminded settlers that perseverance, skill, and cooperation could triumph over adversity, even in an environment defined by scarcity, danger, and relentless challenge. Farming and ranching on the frontier were therefore not merely professions but expressions of survival, endurance, and human ingenuity. Every day, settlers negotiated with nature, risk, and labor, shaping the land and their lives through sweat, determination, and quiet courage. The physical toll was immense, but so too was the reward of survival, of sustaining families, communities, and a fragile economy in one of the harshest environments in history. Through this lens, we see that the frontier was a crucible of endurance. Labor was relentless, risks were constant, yet human ingenuity, cooperation, and sheer determination ensured that life continued. Farming and ranching were testaments to the extraordinary resilience required to inhabit the American West, revealing the intimate, grueling, and often uncelebrated realities behind the mythic landscapes of the frontier. Mining on the frontier promised wealth, opportunity, and the allure of fortune, yet the reality was far harsher than the golden dreams that drew thousands westward. Miners confronted treacherous terrain, unpredictable weather, primitive equipment, and relentless physical labor. Gold and silver were not simply dug from the earth, they had to be wrested from rock, clay, and sand through backbreaking effort, ingenuity, and enduring patience. Early mornings began with the ringing of a bell or the shouts of camp foremen. Men wielded pickaxes, shovels, and pans, breaking apart rock by hand, hauling dirt, and sifting through sediment in search of precious metals. Hours were long, days were relentless, and the work demanded both endurance and skill. Injuries were frequent, falls, crushing accidents, and exposure to hazardous materials were commonplace. Every day carried the possibility of calamity, yet the hope of striking a claim drove miners onward. Environmental hazards were constant. Mines were poorly ventilated, prone to collapse, and filled with dust and toxic gases. Water seepage, unstable rock, and extreme temperatures made every descent dangerous. Accidents often had fatal consequences, and medical care was rudimentary at best. Infection could turn a minor wound into a death sentence, and miners knew that every day brought risk as real as the promise of wealth. Mining camps were microcosms of frontier society, but they were also chaotic and volatile. Transient populations, minimal law enforcement, and the constant tension of competition created an environment rife with conflict. Claim disputes could escalate into violence, alcohol and desperation heightened tempers. Theft, fraud, and gambling were everyday hazards. Survival in these camps required not only physical skill but also social acumen, vigilance, and sometimes ruthless cunning. Life in the camps was austere. Meals were basic and often insufficient, relying on preserved foods or what could be hunted or foraged locally. Shelter was primitive. Tents, shacks, and temporary structures offered little protection from wind, rain, or snow. Comfort was scarce, privacy was minimal, and the mental strain of isolation compounded the physical exhaustion of labor. Many miners experienced despair, homesickness, and depression, their mental resilience tested as harshly as their bodies. Despite the dangers and hardships, mining offered moments of possibility. A promising vein could transform a miner's fortune, providing resources for land, equipment, or family. News of strikes spread quickly, fueling waves of migration and hope. Yet wealth was elusive, few struck it rich, and even those who did faced unpredictable markets, claim disputes, and social pressures that often dissipated gains as quickly as they were made. Mining also shaped relationships and community structures. Miners relied on partnerships to share labor, tools, and knowledge. Camps, though transient, developed informal hierarchies, social norms, and mutual aid systems. Skills, experience, and reputation determined status, while cooperation was essential to navigate hazards, construct tunnels, and manage resources. Even in the harshest conditions, human ingenuity and collaboration found expression in the routines, rituals, and survival strategies of mining life. Environmental and economic consequences were profound. Land was scarred, rivers polluted, and forests stripped to feed fires and construction. Markets fluctuated wildly, influencing food, equipment, and transport availability. Mining communities were in constant flux, rising rapidly with a strike and collapsing just as quickly when resources dwindled. The cycle of boom and bust defined the rhythm of frontier mining towns, leaving behind ghost towns, exhausted claims, and the lingering imprint of human ambition on the landscape. The pursuit of gold, silver, and other minerals embodied the duality of the frontier, hope intertwined with peril, aspiration shadowed by reality. Miners confronted the earth with courage, determination, and sometimes desperation, their lives a testament to endurance, risk, and the human desire for opportunity. Each swing of a pickaxe, each pan of sediment, and each journey to a claim carried significance beyond the immediate task. It was an assertion of survival, an engagement with uncertainty, and a tangible expression of human tenacity. In understanding frontier mining, we recognize not just the promise of wealth, but the profound physical, psychological, and social costs embedded in the pursuit. The myth of instant fortune belies the reality of long hours, physical exhaustion, environmental danger, and constant social tension. Yet, through perseverance, adaptation, and collaboration, miners shaped the economic, social, and geographic contours of the West, leaving a legacy that persists in the land, in culture, and in the stories of human ambition confronted by nature's uncompromising demands. Health on the frontier was a constant negotiation with risk. Disease, injury, and childbirth were ever-present threats, and survival often hinged not on wealth or skill alone but on sheer fortune and the resilience of the human body. Illnesses that might be minor today, fever, infections, respiratory ailments, were potentially fatal. Epidemics could sweep through a settlement with devastating effect, and medical knowledge was rudimentary, constrained by the limits of contemporary science and the realities of isolation. Frontier settlements rarely had trained physicians. When doctors were present, their tools and techniques were basic. There was no anesthesia, no sterilization, and few effective remedies. Bloodletting, poultices, and herbal concoctions were common, their efficacy uneven, sometimes worsening conditions rather than improving them. Surgery was performed under primitive conditions, with crude instruments and little understanding of infection. Even minor injuries, cuts, broken bones, burns, could become lethal if they became infected, a reality that shaped daily behavior and caution. Childbirth was particularly perilous. Maternal mortality rates were high, and neonatal survival was uncertain. Midwives often relied on experience, intuition, and traditional remedies, providing care that could be life-saving yet was fraught with risk. Pregnant women faced physical strain from labor and travel, poor nutrition, and limited access to effective medical intervention. The arrival of a child could be a moment of hope or of profound tragedy, underscoring the fragility and unpredictability of life on the frontier. Infectious diseases, smallpox, cholera, typhoid, influenza, were relentless threats. Contaminated water, poor sanitation, and crowded living conditions facilitated their spread. Frontier communities often lacked knowledge of germ theory, relying instead on isolation, superstition, and herbal remedies to combat illness. Quarantines were difficult to enforce, and mortality rates were high, especially among children, the elderly, and the already weakened. Every outbreak demanded vigilance, cooperation, and endurance. Nutrition and food scarcity further compromised health. Diets were monotonous, limited to what could be grown, hunted, or preserved. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making settlers more vulnerable to disease. Seasonal variation, harsh winters, droughts, or floods, could exacerbate scarcity, leaving families to survive on meager rations, often insufficient to maintain health or strength. Mental health, though less discussed in historical records, was also affected. The constant threat of illness, coupled with isolation, overwork, and grief from frequent deaths, produced stress, anxiety, and despair. Communities adapted through mutual support, shared labor, and social rituals, yet the psychological toll was pervasive. Resilience, both physical and emotional, was as essential as practical skill in sustaining life. Frontier medicine was a blend of necessity, improvisation, and adaptation. Settlers relied on local knowledge, herbal remedies, and guidance from elders. Every family kept a stock of medicines, poultices, and first aid supplies. Skills in recognizing symptoms, improvising treatment, and managing risk became crucial. Knowledge was passed orally and through observation, creating a practical, experiential understanding of health that complemented and sometimes substituted for formal medical training. Prevention was as vital as treatment. Communities organized around sanitation, water collection, and firewood management to reduce risk. Vaccination campaigns, when available, were embraced cautiously. Awareness of seasonal risks, hygiene, and nutrition became part of the rhythm of life. woven into daily routines, labor practices, and communal responsibilities. Even amidst these challenges, human endurance prevailed. Survival depended on adaptation, cooperation, and learning from experience. The sick were cared for by families and neighbors, knowledge of remedies, hygiene, and nutrition was shared, and communities developed systems, informal though they might be, to maintain life and reduce suffering. The struggle against disease and injury shaped not only daily routines but also social norms, collective responsibility, and the understanding of vulnerability and resilience. In reflecting on the medical realities of the frontier, we see that survival was never guaranteed, and every life was a testament to endurance, resourcefulness, and courage. Health was fragile, medicine was limited, and mortality was a constant companion. Yet, through these struggles, settlers and their communities developed practices, knowledge, and networks that enabled them to navigate one of the harshest environments in history. The frontier demanded not only physical labor and ingenuity but also vigilance, cooperation, and the quiet fortitude to face illness, injury, and the relentless uncertainty of life. Law on the frontier existed in tension with the vastness of the land, the isolation of settlements, and the complexity of human behavior. Formal structures of justice were sparse, uneven, and often under-resourced, leaving towns, mining camps, and homesteads to navigate crime, disputes, and punishment with varying degrees of authority and effectiveness. The romanticized figure of the sheriff, dispensing swift and impartial justice, obscures the reality of a legal system that was inconsistent, improvisational, and frequently dependent on personal reputation and courage rather than codified law. Settlements faced a broad spectrum of lawlessness. Theft, property disputes, assault, and murder were common, fueled by scarcity, stress, alcohol, and competition. Crime was not organized like in modern urban centers. It was spontaneous, opportunistic, and often personal. Those with wealth, influence, or physical prowess could protect themselves more effectively than others, yet even the strong were vulnerable in a society where distance, isolation, and unpredictability defined every interaction. Sheriffs, marshals, and constables operated with limited resources and personnel. Travel between towns was slow and dangerous, leaving many areas effectively beyond formal law enforcement. In these regions, justice was often administered informally, relying on community consensus, negotiation, or, at times, violent reprisal. The boundary between law and vigilantism was blurred, as communities took responsibility for maintaining order when formal institutions could not respond. Vigilante justice was a response to both necessity and frustration. Mobs, committees, and local leaders enforced social norms, punished perceived wrongdoers, and attempted to prevent further crime. Yet, this system was deeply imperfect. Accusations could be based on rumor, prejudice, or personal rivalry. Punishments were often severe, public, and irreversible, ranging from beatings to lynchings. Vigilantism reflected the fragility of social order, the limitations of frontier law, and the moral ambiguities inherent in survival under isolation and threat. Criminality itself was shaped by the environment. The frontier demanded resourcefulness, and for some, stealing livestock, goods, or tools was a necessary adaptation to poverty, displacement, or opportunity. While law sought to define right and wrong, everyday survival often forced people into morally gray decisions. Understanding frontier crime requires seeing it not only as deviance but as a product of economic necessity, environmental constraint, and social fragmentation. Town life oscillated between vigilance and cooperation. Communities developed informal networks to monitor suspicious activity, warn neighbors, and protect property. Social cohesion was essential. Survival depended on the collective enforcement of norms and mutual support. Celebrations, church gatherings, and work cooperation all reinforced bonds, even as conflicts and disputes constantly tested the boundaries of trust and authority. Conflict resolution often relied on negotiation, reputation, and physical presence rather than legal documentation. Honor, social standing, and alliances shaped outcomes as much as formal law. A respected individual might mediate disputes, a physically formidable figure could deter aggression, a communal council might impose a compromise. Yet unpredictability remained, and even the best strategies could fail in moments of passion, scarcity, or misunderstanding. The myth of the Wild West, with its heroic lawmen and clear-cut morality, obscures the daily reality of legal ambiguity. Justice was messy, inconsistent, and often subjective. Those entrusted with enforcing law operated under immense pressure, with limited support, in environments where violence, desperation, and isolation were omnipresent. The courage required was not only in confrontation but in judgment, discernment, and the capacity to act fairly under conditions of uncertainty and risk. Frontier justice, whether formal or vigilante, shaped the social fabric of communities. It enforced norms, deterred crime, and provided a framework, however imperfect, for coexistence. At the same time, it reflected the limitations and pressures of a society defined by isolation, scarcity, and rapid change. Every decision, every act of enforcement, every negotiation and confrontation contributed to the evolving understanding of law, morality, and responsibility in a landscape where survival and justice were intertwined. In this delicate balance, the frontier revealed both the potential and the peril of human organization. Communities could enforce norms, protect their members, and maintain order, yet they were always at the mercy of human error, prejudice, and circumstance. The legacy of frontier law persists in American culture, reminding us that justice is not only a matter of rules but of courage, judgment, and collective resilience. The reality of law and order on the frontier challenges the stories of heroism and cinematic spectacle, showing instead a world defined by negotiation, vigilance, and adaptability. It is a world where morality and survival intersected, where courage took many forms, and where the ordinary, steady efforts of people maintaining peace, protecting property, and resolving disputes quietly shaped the enduring legacy of the American West. The arrival of the railroad heralded a new era in the American West, transforming landscapes, economies, and societies with a force as profound as it was relentless. Tracks stretched across mountains, plains, and deserts, linking distant settlements to national markets and enabling the movement of people, goods, and ideas at an unprecedented pace. The frontier was no longer defined solely by isolation and scarcity. It became a network of opportunity, risk, and change. Railroads accelerated migration, drawing settlers deeper into the continent. Towns sprouted along tracks, often overnight, as stations became centers of commerce, communication, and social life. These hubs offered access to markets, supplies, and news, shrinking distances that had once defined the isolation of the frontier. Yet, this connectivity came at a cost. Railroads were agents of corporate power, reshaping local economies, land ownership, and social hierarchies. Small operators, independent farmers, and miners often struggled against monopolies, fluctuating rates, and the influence of distant investors. The physical construction of railroads was itself a monumental endeavor. Workers, many of them immigrants from China, Ireland, and Europe, labored in perilous conditions, laying track over rugged terrain, blasting tunnels through mountains, and building bridges over rivers. Accidents, disease, and exhaustion were constant companions, and the human cost of expansion was staggering. Yet, through skill, endurance, and collective effort, the steel arteries of the West took shape, permanently altering both the land and the people who inhabited it. Railroads also transformed agriculture and ranching. Farmers gained access to distant markets, enabling the sale of surplus crops and livestock. Ranchers could move cattle more efficiently, reaching cities and ports far beyond their immediate environment. Yet, these benefits were accompanied by dependency, prices, transport fees, and corporate policies increasingly dictated the fortunes of frontier families. Success required navigation of both environmental challenges and economic structures imposed from afar. Cultural and social dynamics shifted as well. Railroads brought diverse populations into closer contact, facilitating migration, commerce, and exchange. Yet, they also intensified conflicts over land, water, and labor. Indigenous populations faced accelerated displacement as tracks bisected traditional territories, and expansion disrupted ecosystems that had sustained generations. Railroads were not merely tools of connectivity, they were instruments of profound social, environmental, and cultural change. The environmental impact was immediate and visible. Forests were cleared, rivers diverted, and plains cut by steel lines. Dust, smoke, and noise altered the rhythms of life. Settlements adapted to these changes, with new patterns of labor, commerce, and habitation emerging around stations and depots. The land itself became a stage for industry, revealing both the possibilities and the consequences of technological ambition. Economic opportunity was accompanied by tension and inequality. Corporations consolidated wealth and power, challenging the independence of settlers, small business owners, and local governments. Railroads shaped settlement patterns, dictated trade routes, and influenced political power. The promise of progress was inseparable from the realities of exploitation, regulation, and resistance. Communities negotiated these changes in varied ways, balancing adaptation with preservation of autonomy, tradition, and survival strategies. The mythology of the West, already shaped by literature, performance, and legend, encountered a new reality in the railroads. Expansion and connectivity contradicted the isolation, self-reliance, and romantic heroism of frontier life, introducing complexity, regulation, and industrial oversight. Yet, the railroad also embodied aspiration, linking dreams to possibility and offering tangible evidence of human ingenuity and determination. It was a symbol of progress, a harbinger of transformation, and a reminder that the frontier was evolving from untamed wilderness to integrated, dynamic society. Through railroads, the American West was stitched into a broader national and global fabric. Trade, travel, communication, and culture converged along steel lines, bringing prosperity, conflict, and change. The frontier was no longer a distant, isolated world. It became part of a networked economy and society, where human ambition, labor, and endurance intersected with technology, policy, and geography. This transformation illustrates the duality of frontier life: opportunity intertwined with hardship, progress shadowed by exploitation, and connectivity tempered by uncertainty. Railroads exemplified the frontier's continuing evolution, reflecting human resilience, ingenuity, and the capacity to reshape both environment and society. In understanding the railroad era, we recognize that the West was a living, changing entity, its landscapes, people, and culture shaped by endurance, adaptation, and the relentless drive to bridge distance, opportunity, and human aspiration. The story of railroads is not merely one of tracks and trains. It is a narrative of courage, labor, and the negotiation of change. It embodies the triumphs and trials of the frontier, the tensions between independence and industrial power, and the enduring human desire to connect, explore, and thrive. In the movement of steel and steam across mountains and plains, we see the embodiment of the West itself, vast, challenging, dynamic, and ultimately transformed by the determination, labor, and ingenuity of those who dared to inhabit its spaces. The frontier was a tapestry of cultural diversity, woven from the threads of countless peoples seeking opportunity, survival, or refuge. Far from the homogenized, romanticized version portrayed in popular imagination, frontier society was complex, dynamic, and often contentious. Native Americans, European settlers, Mexican communities, Chinese immigrants, and African Americans lived, labored, and interacted within a shared space, shaping and reshaping the social fabric through cooperation, conflict, and coexistence. Native American nations faced displacement, violence, and the erosion of their traditional ways of life. Treaties, often violated, and military campaigns systematically removed indigenous peoples from ancestral lands, fracturing communities and severing cultural continuity. Despite these pressures, Native Americans maintained practices, traditions, and social networks, navigating survival while negotiating a rapidly changing landscape dominated by settlers and corporate interests. Their resilience under conditions of systemic oppression testifies to the depth of human endurance and cultural tenacity. Immigrants brought skills, labor, and cultural richness, yet they often endured discrimination, marginalization, and exploitation. Chinese laborers, essential in building railroads and working mines, faced exclusionary laws and violence but contributed materially and socially to frontier communities. Mexican Americans preserved traditions, language, and agricultural expertise, often mediating between Anglo settlers and indigenous peoples. African Americans, including freedmen and black cowboys, navigated both opportunity and prejudice, asserting identity and skill in a world structured by hierarchy, racism, and scarcity. European settlers brought diverse customs, religions, and social structures, blending practices from their homelands with the necessities of frontier life. Towns reflected this mixture through architecture, public spaces, and community institutions. Churches, schools, and local organizations became hubs of social cohesion, offering education, spiritual support, and collective organization in an environment of isolation and risk. Festivals, markets, and communal labor reinforced bonds, creating networks of support that were vital for survival. Life on the frontier required negotiation across cultural boundaries. Trade, labor, and shared labor projects facilitated interaction, while conflicts over land, resources, and authority tested alliances and social resilience. Cooperation was often essential. Communities survived or thrived based on their ability to integrate diverse peoples, recognize skills, and mediate disputes. Social harmony was neither automatic nor guaranteed, but where it existed, it enhanced survival, morale, and economic success. Discrimination and violence, however, were persistent realities. Social hierarchies were enforced through law, custom, and sometimes brute force. Marginalized groups navigated precarious positions, relying on networks of family, labor, and mutual aid to maintain stability. Everyday interactions demanded negotiation, discretion, and adaptation, as individuals balanced the desire for autonomy with the imperatives of survival within a broader social ecosystem. Cultural exchange was a subtle, continuous process. Foodways, clothing, music, and labor techniques traveled across boundaries. European farming practices merged with indigenous knowledge of the land. Mexican ranching techniques influenced cattle management. Chinese gardening and culinary practices enriched local diets. Even under duress, human creativity flourished, producing a hybrid, pragmatic culture attuned to the demands of frontier life. Communities developed informal institutions to maintain order and social life. Town councils, committees, and informal assemblies mediated disputes, managed resources, and organized defense. Religious gatherings, communal labor days, and educational efforts fostered cohesion, while informal networks of gossip, assistance, and alliance supported daily survival. Social life was deeply practical, shaped by necessity as much as tradition, yet it also created meaning, identity, and continuity amidst uncertainty. The frontier's diversity, juxtaposed with harsh environmental and social conditions, created a unique social landscape. It was a world of challenge and opportunity, of tension and cooperation, where human resilience, ingenuity, and adaptation were expressed through daily interactions, collective endeavors, and cultural exchange. Understanding the frontier in this way reveals its richness, complexity, and the human stories often obscured by myth, legend, or nostalgia. Frontier society was neither simple nor monolithic. It was a living network of adaptation, survival, and cultural negotiation. Through trade, labor, and social bonds, individuals and communities created a fragile but resilient fabric of life. They built networks of mutual support, shared knowledge, and practical skills that allowed them to navigate uncertainty, manage risk, and sustain human connection in a landscape defined by isolation, danger, and relentless change. In exploring cultural diversity and social life on the frontier, we recognize the extraordinary human capacity to adapt, cooperate, and endure. The American West was not a blank canvas upon which settlers imposed a singular vision. It was a vibrant, contested, and dynamic arena where multiple cultures intersected, collided, and coexisted. The resilience, ingenuity, and humanity displayed in this mosaic form a crucial part of the legacy of the frontier, offering insight into both historical reality and the enduring impact of these communities on the identity and culture of the West. Frontier towns were more than mere settlements. They were lifelines in the vast, often unforgiving landscape of the American West. These towns served as social, economic, and cultural hubs, places where people gathered to trade, communicate, seek entertainment, and maintain a semblance of order amidst the challenges of isolation, labor, and environmental hardship. Every town was unique, shaped by geography, resources, population composition, and the complex interplay of survival and aspiration. At the heart of these communities were the rhythms of daily life. Towns offered access to goods that settlers could not produce themselves: flour, sugar, tools, fabric, and other essentials. Merchants maintained inventories that reflected both necessity and the aspirations of settlers seeking comfort or status. The general store became a place of commerce, gossip, and social connection, where news from distant places arrived alongside shipments of provisions and equipment. Social interaction was intertwined with commerce. Saloon doors swung open to the sound of laughter, conversation, and the occasional argument. These establishments provided more than alcohol. They were gathering places where travelers, laborers, ranchers, and townsfolk exchanged information, forged alliances, and relieved the mental strain of frontier life. Card games, storytelling, and music infused even the harshest settlements with a sense of continuity and humanity. Religious institutions were equally central, offering spiritual guidance, moral instruction, and a framework for communal cohesion. Churches hosted worship, education, and social gatherings. Sunday services punctuated the workweek, bringing together families, neighbors, and transient laborers in shared rituals. These institutions reinforced social norms, provided moral frameworks, and offered emotional and spiritual support in a world where external threats were constant. Education was both a practical necessity and a symbol of community investment in the future. Small schoolhouses accommodated children of settlers, teaching basic literacy, arithmetic, and social norms. Teachers were often itinerant or multifunctional, balancing education with other responsibilities. Yet even within these modest structures, the rhythms of learning created stability, routine, and hope, instilling values and knowledge crucial for life on the frontier. Work extended beyond private homesteads into communal effort. Towns required maintenance, whether repairing streets, reinforcing structures, or constructing wells and water systems. Labor was organized, shared, and often voluntary, reflecting the interdependence essential for survival. Social cohesion, trust, and practical collaboration were cultivated through daily participation, reinforcing the notion that the survival of the individual was inseparable from the survival of the community. The physical environment shaped every aspect of town life. Dust, mud, heat, and cold infiltrated streets, homes, and workplaces. Water was often scarce or contaminated, sanitation limited, and medical care rudimentary. Life required constant vigilance, adaptability, and ingenuity. Residents improvised, recycled, and innovated to maintain order and function, creating solutions that balanced necessity, skill, and cooperation. Entertainment, celebration, and ritual punctuated the daily grind, providing moments of reprieve and social cohesion. Festivals, dances, and communal meals fostered identity and connection. Storytelling, oral, performative, and later literary, reinforced collective memory, moral lessons, and shared understanding of the environment, labor, and human endeavor. Even the smallest acts, playing music, sharing a meal, or attending a gathering, were acts of social cohesion that preserved culture and resilience. Conflict and tension persisted alongside cooperation. Competition for resources, social hierarchy, and disputes over land or labor could escalate into arguments or physical confrontation. The presence of law, informal justice, or vigilante intervention shaped outcomes, but every interaction demanded judgment, tact, and negotiation. Life in the town was an ongoing balancing act, requiring residents to navigate social, economic, and environmental pressures with intelligence, courage, and patience. Through these daily routines, frontier towns became more than settlements. They were crucibles of human adaptation, social negotiation, and cultural synthesis. They embodied resilience, creativity, and the capacity to sustain life, order, and community under conditions of scarcity, danger, and unpredictability. Observing the rhythms of a frontier town offers insight into the practical, social, and emotional scaffolding that allowed individuals and communities to endure, adapt, and even flourish despite the relentless challenges of the American West. In essence, frontier towns were living entities, defined by the labor, interaction, and endurance of their inhabitants. They were spaces where culture, economy, law, and social life converged, reflecting the extraordinary human capacity to build order, connection, and meaning in the midst of vast and often unforgiving landscapes. Through these towns, the story of the frontier is not only one of survival but also of ingenuity, resilience, and the ongoing negotiation of human life with the environment and with one another. The life of cowboys, though often romanticized in song and cinema, was defined by relentless labor, risk, and endurance. Cattle drives, the backbone of ranching in the post-Civil War West, required the coordination of men, animals, and terrain across hundreds of miles of open prairie, often under unpredictable weather and environmental hazards. Every day demanded vigilance, skill, and physical stamina, as cowboys navigated challenges that could claim both livestock and human life. A cattle drive began with careful preparation. Herds were rounded from pastures, counted, and organized by age, size, and temperament. Supplies, food, water, tack, tools, and bedding had to be meticulously planned, as resupply along remote trails was uncertain. Horses were chosen for endurance and temperament, their care a daily necessity. Every cowboy carried responsibility not only for personal survival but also for the management, movement, and safety of the herd. Daily life on the trail was strenuous. Riding for hours on end, cowboys contended with heat, cold, rain, wind, and dust. Trails were often rough, unmarked, and littered with natural obstacles, rivers to ford, canyons to navigate, and predators to evade. Injuries were common, from falls, rope burns, and horn goring to exposure-related ailments. Medical care was minimal, and recovery often depended on sheer will and adaptability. Cattle themselves were both resource and challenge. Herds could stampede with little warning, driven by thunder, fire, or fear, requiring quick thinking and coordinated action to prevent disaster. Illness, injury, or predation reduced numbers and demanded constant attention. Cowboys learned to read animal behavior, anticipate danger, and respond swiftly to emergencies, developing an intimate knowledge of both herd and landscape. Life on the trail was communal yet hierarchical. Cowboys relied on one another for safety, coordination, and morale. A trail boss directed movements, assigned responsibilities, and maintained order, while cook crews prepared meals over open fires, often improvising with limited supplies. Social cohesion was essential. Conflict could jeopardize not only efficiency but survival. Humor, storytelling, and camaraderie served as critical mechanisms for maintaining morale in conditions of isolation and exhaustion. Ranch life extended beyond the trail. Maintenance of fences, barns, water sources, and grazing areas demanded continuous labor. Cowboys and ranchers managed breeding, branding, and disease control, balancing economic imperatives with the physical limits of both animals and humans. Seasonal rhythms, calving, roundups, and sales, dictated cycles of intense labor, punctuated by periods of waiting, monitoring, and strategic planning. Economic pressures were ever present. Cattle prices fluctuated, markets shifted, and competition with neighboring ranches or corporate interests created tension. The frontier demanded both physical and financial acumen, as decisions on herd management, grazing, and transport could determine prosperity or ruin. Success required foresight, experience, and the ability to adapt to both natural and economic unpredictability. Cultural identity was embedded in the practices, clothing, and rituals of ranching life. Cowboys adopted skills, language, and traditions drawn from Mexican vaqueros, indigenous peoples, and earlier European settlers. Branding, roping, riding techniques, and storytelling carried knowledge essential for survival while reinforcing community identity. Clothing, boots, hats, chaps, and spurs, was both practical and symbolic, signifying skill, experience, and belonging within this rugged social world. Isolation was a constant companion. Long hours on horseback, nights under the stars, and weeks away from towns or family forged resilience, self-reliance, and adaptability. Yet, human connection remained crucial. Gatherings at town markets, dances, or saloons provided social relief, exchange of news, and reinforcement of community bonds, balancing solitude with interaction, labor with leisure. The life of cowboys reveals the frontier as a space of both hardship and ingenuity. Physical labor, environmental challenge, and economic uncertainty shaped daily routines, while cultural exchange, community, and practical knowledge sustained both individuals and herds. Understanding this life uncovers the reality behind the myth, a world defined by endurance, skill, and adaptation, where freedom was inseparable from responsibility, danger, and collaboration. Cowboys were not solitary heroes but participants in a network of human and animal labor, bound by interdependence, environmental understanding, and shared purpose. Their story illuminates the broader frontier experience, a landscape demanding both ingenuity and endurance, a society negotiating survival and aspiration, and a culture forged in motion, labor, and resilience. Through the lens of ranching and cattle drives, the American West emerges not as a romanticized playground of adventure but as a living environment of challenge, connection, and transformation, a testament to human perseverance, adaptability, and the continuous interplay between people, animals, and the land they sought to inhabit, understand, and shape. Mining towns emerged in response to the allure of gold, silver, and other precious resources, drawing hopeful men and families into harsh, often unforgiving environments. The promise of wealth fueled migration and settlement, yet the reality of frontier mining was grueling labor, economic uncertainty, and daily confrontation with danger. These towns were microcosms of frontier life, reflecting both human ambition and the consequences of environmental exploitation. From the moment dawn touched the rugged slopes, miners labored under physically punishing conditions. Pickaxes struck rock, shovels turned earth, and sluice boxes channeled water to separate mineral from soil. Dust, noise, and exhaustion accompanied every motion. Workdays were long, extending from sunrise to sunset, and the physical toll was relentless. Injuries, respiratory illness, and fatigue were common, yet labor continued, driven by the hope of a discovery that could transform lives, or simply by the imperative of survival. Mining was dangerous in ways both visible and hidden. Tunnel collapses claimed lives, landslides and rockfalls were constant threats, and exposure to toxic dust, mercury, and other chemicals caused chronic illness. Water was scarce, often contaminated, and food supplies limited. Medical care was rudimentary at best, leaving injuries and illness to be treated with minimal knowledge, rudimentary tools, and improvisation. Survival depended on physical strength, vigilance, and practical ingenuity. Economic realities were harsh and often unforgiving. Only a small fraction of miners found substantial wealth, while many toiled for marginal returns. Ore yields were unpredictable, market prices fluctuated, and expenses for tools, supplies, and transportation eroded gains. Miners operated within a system where the rewards of labor were uncertain and the cost of failure was high. Despite these risks, the frontier spirit, resilient, persistent, and adaptive, drove continued effort, innovation, and community formation. Mining towns themselves were transient, often constructed hastily and lacking durable infrastructure. Wooden shacks, tents, and rudimentary businesses lined narrow streets. Social life emerged from necessity. Communal dining, shared labor, and makeshift entertainment provided respite from exhaustion. Saloons, gambling halls, and theaters offered diversion, but they also reflected vice, conflict, and the struggle to maintain order amidst lawlessness. Diversity was present even in these isolated communities. Immigrants from Europe, Chinese laborers, Mexican miners, and African Americans joined Anglo settlers, each contributing labor, knowledge, and cultural practices. Yet these communities were also marked by tension, competition, and discrimination as scarcity, proximity, and economic pressure amplified social hierarchies and prejudice. Understanding these interactions provides insight into both the resilience and fragility of frontier social networks. Mining life demanded cooperation and knowledge sharing. Experienced miners guided newcomers in prospecting techniques, the use of explosives, water management, and ore extraction. Survival and success depended on observation, apprenticeship, and collective wisdom, highlighting the interdependence that underpinned even ostensibly individualistic pursuits. Community, rather than isolation, often determined the sustainability of both work and life. Environmental impact was profound. Forests were cleared, rivers diverted, and landscapes scarred by excavation, sluices, and tailings. Mining reshaped ecosystems, affected water quality, and altered the terrain permanently. Yet these same changes enabled settlement, commerce, and infrastructure development, illustrating the complex interplay of human ambition, resource extraction, and environmental transformation that characterized the frontier. Despite hardship, miners and their families created a semblance of culture and social cohesion. Schools, churches, and communal spaces offered education, spiritual support, and socialization. Festivals, dances, and shared meals provided relief from labor, reinforcing identity, morale, and collective resilience. Even in transience, these communities reflected human ingenuity and the capacity to create stability amid uncertainty. Ultimately, mining towns and gold rushes reveal a stark duality: immense opportunity shadowed by physical peril, economic instability, and environmental degradation. They exemplify the determination, resourcefulness, and endurance required to survive and occasionally thrive in the frontier. Through the labor of miners, the flow of capital, and the creation of communities, the American West was both exploited and inhabited, shaped by human endeavor and the relentless pursuit of possibility against a backdrop of risk and uncertainty. The story of frontier mining illuminates the broader reality of life in the West. Daily existence was defined by labor, endurance, and adaptation. Wealth was scarce, danger was omnipresent, and survival demanded ingenuity, skill, and collaboration. Yet through these challenges, communities emerged, culture persisted, and the legacy of human resilience in the face of adversity became woven into the enduring narrative of the frontier. As the sun dips behind distant peaks and the dust settles over plains and valleys, the story of the American frontier comes into focus, not as a myth, nor a simplified tale of heroes and villains, but as a complex, human drama defined by endurance, adaptation, and relentless challenge. The frontier was a land of extremes. Harsh climates, unpredictable weather, and scarce resources demanded constant vigilance. Every day, settlers, miners, ranchers, and indigenous peoples faced threats from disease, injury, and environmental hardship. Life expectancy was low, labor was brutal, and survival was never guaranteed. Yet, within this adversity, human resilience and ingenuity flourished. Communities were built, cultures intersected, and knowledge, both practical and social, was shared across generations. Cultural diversity shaped the frontier's character. Native American nations resisted displacement while adapting to a rapidly changing landscape. Immigrants from China, Mexico, Europe, and African Americans contributed labor, skill, and culture, creating a mosaic of human endeavor. These interactions were often fraught with tension, discrimination, and conflict, yet they also fostered cooperation, exchange, and innovation. The frontier was a crucible in which human diversity met challenge, forging resilience and adaptation. Labor defined existence. Miners risked life and limb to extract ore, cowboys endured endless trails under sun, rain, and dust, and farmers wrestled soil and climate to produce sustenance. Every laborer was bound by the demands of survival, the unpredictability of environment, and the pressures of economic necessity. The daily rhythm of work, danger, and ingenuity shaped both character and community, leaving an indelible mark on the land and its people. Violence was real but often chaotic and unromanticized. Law enforcement was inconsistent, vigilante justice was common, and social order required constant negotiation. Gunfights were rare spectacles. Most danger arose from the mundane, but deadly, risks of frontier life: accidents, disputes, or environmental hazards. Yet even in these harsh conditions, social bonds, cooperation, and shared responsibility provided safety, guidance, and resilience. Transformation was inexorable. Railroads stitched the West into the broader nation, linking towns, markets, and people. Economic opportunity expanded, yet corporate power and inequality intensified. The frontier evolved from isolated homesteads and transient mining camps into integrated communities, reflecting both human ambition and the pressures of modernization. Through these changes, the West became a space where human ingenuity, endurance, and adaptability met technological, economic, and social forces beyond individual control. Despite hardship and loss, the legacy of the frontier endures. It is found in the ingenuity, resilience, and adaptability of those who lived there. It is embedded in the landscape itself, the towns, railways, and altered plains that testify to human endeavor. It survives in cultural memory, stories, songs, traditions, and lessons of survival, cooperation, and perseverance. The American West, often mythologized, was ultimately a testament to the human capacity to endure, adapt, and leave a lasting imprint on both land and culture. As the horizon darkens and the first stars appear, one can reflect on this story not as a chronicle of conquest or legend, but as an intimate portrait of survival, community, and endurance. The frontier was never a simple narrative. It was a living world shaped by countless individual lives, choices, and struggles, each leaving a mark on the unfolding story of a nation. The American frontier reminds us that human history is defined not only by triumph but also by perseverance, cooperation, and adaptation in the face of relentless challenges. It teaches the value of resilience, the complexity of cultural interaction, and the enduring impact of human endeavor upon the natural world. And so, as the West faded into memory, leaving behind railroads, towns, and transformed landscapes, it left a legacy, a testament to the courage, labor, and imagination of those who lived within it, a story of endurance written across plains and mountains, rivers and railways, and etched forever into the consciousness of a nation. The frontier ended, but its lessons, its stories, and its enduring spirit continue to resonate, inviting reflection, understanding, and reverence for the lives that shaped it, and for the remarkable resilience of humanity itself.